Chapter 19 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Viestelet. Chapter 19. In the meanwhile, the secret work of Thérèse and Laurent was productive of results. The former had assumed a woeful and despairing demeanour, which at the end of a few days alarmed Madame Raquin. When the old mercer inquired what made her niece so sad, the young woman played the part of an inconsolable widow with consummate skill. She spoke in a vague manner of feeling weary, depressed, of suffering from her nerves, without making any precise complaint. When pressed by her aunt with questions, she replied that she was well, that she could not imagine what it was that made her so low-spirited, and that she shed tears without knowing why. Then the constant choking fits of sobbing, the wan, heart-rending smiles, the spells of crushing silence full of emptiness and despair, continued. The sight of this young woman who was always giving way to her grief, who seemed to be slowly dying of some unknown complaint, ended by seriously alarming Madame Raquin. She had now no one in the whole world but her niece, and she prayed the Almighty every night to preserve her this relative to close her eyes. A little egotism was mingled with this final love of her old age. She felt herself affected in the slight consolations that still assisted her to live, when it crossed her mind that she might die alone in the damp shop in the arcade. From that time she never took her eyes off her niece, and it was with terror that she watched her sadness, wondering what she could do to cure her of her silent despair. Under these grave circumstances she thought she ought to take the advice of her old friend Michaud. One Thursday evening she detained him in the shop, and spoke to him of her alarm. "Of course," answered the old man, with that frank brutality he had acquired in the performance of his former functions. "I have noticed for some time past that Thérèse has been looking sour, and I know very well why her face is quite yellow and overspread with grief." "You know why?" exclaimed the widow. "Speak out at once, if we could only cure her." "Oh, the treatment is simple," resumed Michaud with a laugh. "Your niece finds life irksome because she had been alone for nearly 2 years. She wants a husband, you can see that in her eyes." The brutal frankness of the former commissary gave Madame Raquin a painful shock. She fancied that the wound Thérèse had received through the fatal accident at Saint Ouen was still as fresh, still as cruel at the bottom of her heart. It seemed to her that her son, once dead, Thérèse could have no thought for a husband, and here was Michaud affirming, with a hearty laugh, that Thérèse was out of sorts because she wanted one. "Marry her as soon as you can," as he took himself off, "if you do not wish to see her shrivel up entirely. That is my advice, my dear lady, and it is good, believe me." Madame Raquin could not at first accustom herself to the thought that her son was already forgotten. Old Michaud had not even pronounced the name of Camille, and had made a joke of the pretended illness of Thérèse. The poor mother understood that she alone preserved at the bottom of her heart the living recollection of her dear child, and she wept, for it seemed to her that Camille had just died a second time. Then, when she had had a good cry, and was weary of mourning, she thought in spite of herself of what Michaud had said, and became familiar with the idea of purchasing a little happiness at the cost of a marriage which, according to her delicate mind, was like killing her son again. Frequently she gave way to feelings of cowardice when she came face to face with the dejected and broken down Thérèse amidst the icy silence of the shop. She was not one of those dry, rigid persons who find bitter delight in living a life of eternal despair. Her character was full of pliancy, devotedness, and effusion, which contributed to make up her temperament of a stout and affable good lady, and prompted her to live in a state of active tenderness. Since her niece no longer spoke, and remained there pale and feeble, her own life became intolerable, while the shop seemed to her like a tomb. What she required was to find some warm affection beside her, some liveliness, some caresses, something sweet and gay which would help her to wait peacefully for death. It was these unconscious desires that made her accept the idea of marrying Thérèse again. She even forgot her son a little. In the existence of the tomb that she was leading came a sort of awakening, something like a will and fresh occupation for the mind. She sought a husband for her niece, and this search gave her matter for consideration. The choice of a husband was an important business. The poor old lady thought much more of her own comfort than of Thérèse. She wished to marry her niece in order to be happy herself, for she had keen misgivings lest the new husband of the young woman should come and trouble the last hours of her old age. The idea that she was about to introduce a stranger into her daily existence terrified her. It was this thought alone that stopped her, that prevented her from talking openly with her niece about matrimony. While Thérèse acted the comedy of weariness and dejection with that perfect hypocrisy she had acquired by her education, Laurent took the part of a sensible and serviceable man. He was full of little attentions for the two women, particularly for Madame Raquin, whom he overwhelmed with delicate attention. Little by little he made himself indispensable in the shop. It was him alone who brought a little gaiety into this black hole. When he did not happen to be there of an evening, the old mercer searched round her ill at ease, as if she missed something, being almost afraid to find herself face to face with the despairing Thérèse. But Laurent only occasionally absented himself to better prove his power. He went to the shop daily on quitting his office, and remained there until the arcade was closed at night. He ran the errands, and handed Madame Raquin, who could only walk with difficulty, the small articles she required. Then he seated himself and chatted. He had acquired the gentle, penetrating voice of an actor, which he employed to flatter the ears and heart of the good old lady. In a friendly way, he seemed particularly anxious about the health of Thérèse, like a tender-hearted man who feels for the sufferings of others. On repeated occasions he took Madame Raquin to one side, and terrified her by appearing very much alarmed himself at the changes and ravages he said he perceived on the face of the young woman. "We shall soon lose her," he murmured in a tearful voice. "We cannot conceal from ourselves that she is extremely ill. Ah, alas, for our poor happiness and our nice tranquil evenings!" Madame Raquin listened to him with anguish. Laurent even had the audacity to speak of Camille. "You see," said he to the mercer, "the death of my poor friend has been a terrible blow to her. She had been dying for the last 2 years, since that fatal day when she lost Camille. Nothing will console her, nothing will cure her. We must be resigned." These impudent falsehoods made the old lady shed bitter tears. The memory of her son troubled and blinded her. Each time the name of Camille was pronounced, she gave way, bursting into sobs. She would have embraced the person who mentioned her poor boy. Laurent had noticed the trouble and outburst of tender feeling that this name produced. He could make her weep at will, upset her with such emotion that she failed to distinguish the clear aspect of things, and he took advantage of this power to always hold her pliant and in pain in his hand, as it were. Each evening, in spite of the secret revolt of his trembling inner being, he brought the conversation to bear on the rare qualities, on the tender heart and mind of Camille, praising his victim with almost shameless impudence. At moments, when he found the eyes of Thérèse fixed with a strange expression on his own, he shuddered, and ended by believing all the good he had been saying about the drowned man. Then he held his tongue, suddenly seized with atrocious jealousy, fearing that the young widow loved the man he had flung into the water, and whom he now lauded with the conviction of an enthusiast. Throughout the conversation Madame Raquin was in tears, and unable to distinguish anything around her. As she wept, she reflected that Laurent must have a loving and generous heart. He alone remembered her son. He alone still spoke of him in a trembling and affected voice. She dried her eyes, gazing at the young man with infinite tenderness, and feeling that she loved him as her own child. One Thursday evening, Michaud and Grivet were already in the dining room when Laurent, coming in, approached Thérèse, and with gentle anxiety inquired after her health. He seated himself for a moment beside her, performing, for the edification of the persons present, his part of an alarmed and affectionate friend. As the young couple sat close together, exchanging a few words, Michaud, who was observing them, bent down and said in a low voice to the old mercer as he pointed to Laurent, "Look, there is the husband who will suit your niece. Arrange this marriage quickly. We will assist you if it be necessary." This remark came as a revelation to Madame Raquin. She saw at once all the advantages she would derive, personally, from the union of Thérèse and Laurent. The marriage would tighten the bonds already connected her and her niece with the friend of her son, with that good-natured fellow who came to amuse them in the evening. In this manner, she would not be introducing a stranger into her home, she would not run the risk of unhappiness. On the contrary, while giving Thérèse a support, she added another joy to her old age. She found a second son in this young man, who for 3 years had shown her such filial affection. Then it occurred to her that Thérèse would be less faithless to the memory of Camille by marrying Laurent. The religion of the heart is peculiarly delicate. Madame Raquin, who would have wept to see a stranger embrace the young widow, felt no repulsion at the thought of giving her to the comrade of her son. Throughout the evening, while the guests played at dominoes, the old mercer watched the couple so tenderly that they guessed the comedy had succeeded, and that the denouement was at hand. Michaud, before withdrawing, had a short conversation in an undertone with Madame Raquin. Then he pointedly took the arm of Laurent, saying he would accompany him a bit of the way. As Laurent went off, he exchanged a rapid glance with Thérèse, a glance full of urgent enjoyment. Michaud had undertaken to feel the ground. He found the young man very much devoted to the two ladies, but exceedingly astonished at the idea of a marriage between Thérèse and himself. Laurent added, in an unsteady tone of voice, that he loved the widow of his poor friend as a sister, and that it would seem to him a perfect sacrilege to marry her. The former commissary of police insisted, giving numerous good reasons with a view to obtaining his consent. He even spoke of devotedness, and went so far as to tell the young man that it was clearly his duty to give a son to Madame Raquin and a husband to Thérèse. Little by little, Laurent allowed himself to be won over, feigning to give way to emotion, to accept the idea of this marriage as one fallen from the clouds, dictated by feelings of devotedness and duty, as old Michaud had said. When the latter had obtained a formal answer in the affirmative, he parted with his companion, rubbing his hands, for he fancied he had just gained a great victory. He prided himself on having had the first idea of this marriage, which would convey to the Thursday evenings all their former gaiety. While Michaud was talking with Laurent, slowly following the quays, Madame Raquin had an almost identical conversation with Thérèse. At the moment when her niece, pale and unsteady in gait as usual, was about to retire to rest, the old mercer detained her an instant. She questioned her in a tender tone, imploring her to be frank, and confess the cause of the trouble that overwhelmed her. Then, as she only obtained vague replies, she spoke of the emptiness of widowhood, and little by little came to talk in a more precise manner of the offer of a second marriage, concluding by asking Thérèse, plainly, whether she had not a secret desire to marry again. Thérèse protested, saying that such a thought had never entered her mind, and that she intended remaining faithful to Camille. Madame Raquin began to weep. Pleading against her heart, she gave her niece to understand that despair should not be eternal, and, finally, in response to an exclamation of the young woman saying she would never replace Camille, Madame Raquin abruptly pronounced the name of Laurent. Then she enlarged with a flood of words on the propriety and advantages of such an union. She poured out her mind, repeating aloud all she had been thinking during the evening, depicting with naive egotism the picture of her final days of happiness between her two dear children. Thérèse, resigned and docile, listened to her with bowed head, ready to give satisfaction to her slightest wish. "I love Laurent as a brother," said she grievously, when her aunt had ceased speaking, "but, as you desire it, I will endeavour to love him as a husband. I wish to make you happy. I had hoped that you would have allowed me to weep in peace, but I will dry my tears, as it is a question of your happiness." She kissed the old lady, who remained surprised and frightened at having been the first to forget her son. As Madame Raquin went to bed she sobbed bitterly, accusing herself of having less strength than Thérèse, and of desiring out of egotism a marriage that the young widow accepted by simple abnegation. The following morning Michaud and his old friend had a short conversation in the arcade before the door of the shop, where they communicated to one another the result of their efforts, and agreed to hurry matters on by forcing the young people to become affianced the same evening. At 5 o'clock Michaud was already in the shop when Laurent entered. As soon as the young man had seated himself, the former commissary of police said in his ear, "She accepts." This blunt remark was overheard by Thérèse, who remained pale, with her eyes impudently fixed on Laurent. The two sweethearts looked at each other for a few seconds as if consulting. Both understood that they must accept the position without hesitation, and finish the business at one stroke. Laurent, rising, went and took the hand of Madame Raquin, who made every effort to restrain her tears. "Dear mother," said he, smiling, "I was talking about your felicity last night with Monsieur Michaud. Your children wish to make you happy." The poor old lady, on hearing herself called "dear mother," allowed her tears to flow. She quietly seized the hand of Thérèse and placed it in that of Laurent, unable to utter a single word. The two sweethearts shivered on feeling their skins touch, and remained with their burning fingers pressed together in a nervous clasp. After a pause, the young man, in a hesitating tone, resumed, "Thérèse, shall we give your aunt a bright and peaceful existence?" "Yes," feebly replied the young woman, "we have a duty to perform." Then Laurent, becoming very pale, turned towards Madame Raquin and added, "When Camille fell into the water, he shouted out to me, 'Save my wife, I entrust her to you.' I believe I am acting in accordance with his last wish in marrying Thérèse." Thérèse, on hearing these words, let go the hand of Laurent. She had received a shock like a blow in the chest. The impudence of her sweetheart overwhelmed her. She observed him with a senseless look, while Madame Raquin, half stifled by sobs, stammered, "Yes, yes, my friend, marry her, make her happy. My son from the depth of his tomb will thank you." Laurent, feeling himself giving way, leant on the back of a chair, while Michaud, who was himself moved to tears, pushed him towards Thérèse with the remark, "Kiss one another, it will be your betrothal." When the lips of the young man came in contact with the cheeks of the widow, he experienced a peculiarly uncomfortable feeling, while the latter abruptly drew back, as if the two kisses of her sweetheart burnt her. This was the first caress he had given her in the presence of witnesses. All her blood rushed to her face, and she felt herself red and burning. After this crisis the two murderers breathed. Their marriage was decided on. At last they approached the goal they had so long had in view. Everything was settled the same evening. The Thursday following, the marriage was announced to Grivet, as well as to Olivier and his wife. Michaud, in communicating the news to them, did not conceal his delight. He rubbed his hands, repeating as he did so, "It was I who thought of it. It is I who have married them. You will see what a nice couple they'll make." Suzanne silently embraced Thérèse. This poor creature, who was half dead and as white as a sheet, had formed a friendship for the rigid and sombre young widow. She showed her a sort of childlike affection mingled with a kind of respectful terror. Olivier complimented the aunt and niece, while Grivet hazarded a few spicy jokes that met with middling success. Altogether the company were delighted, enchanted, and declared that everything was for the best. In reality, all they thought about was the wedding feast. Thérèse and Laurent were clever enough to maintain a suitable demeanour, by simply displaying a tender and obliging friendship to one another. They gave themselves an air of accomplishing an act of supreme devotedness. Nothing in their faces betrayed a suspicion of the terror and desire that disturbed them. Madame Raquin watched the couple with faint smiles, and a look of feeble but grateful goodwill. A few formalities required fulfilling. Laurent had to write to his father to ask his consent to the marriage. The old peasant of Jeufosse, who had almost forgotten that he had a son at Paris, answered him in 4 lines, that he could marry, and go and get hanged if he chose. He gave him to understand that being resolved never to give him her sou, he left him master of his body, and authorized him to be guilty of all imaginable follies. A permission accorded in such terms caused Laurent singular anxiety. Madame Raquin, after reading the letter of this unnatural father, in a transport of kind-heartedness, acted very foolishly. She made over to her niece the 40,000 francs and more that she possessed, stripping herself entirely for the young couple, on whose affection she relied, with the desire of being indebted to them for all her happiness. Laurent brought nothing into the community, and he even gave it to be understood that he did not always intend to remain in his present employment, but would perhaps take up painting again. In any case, the future of the little family was assured. The interest on the money put aside, added to the profit on the mercery business, would be sufficient to keep 3 persons comfortably. As a matter of fact, it was only just sufficient to make them happy. The preparations for the marriage were hurried on, the formalities being abridged as much as possible, and, at last, the welcome day arrived. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vistelli. Chapter 20. In the morning, Laurent and Thérèse awoke in their respective rooms, with the same feeling of profound joy in their hearts. Both said to themselves that their last night of terror had passed. They would no longer have to sleep alone, and they would mutually defend themselves against the drowned man. Thérèse looked around her, giving a strange smile as she measured her great bed with her eyes. She rose and began to slowly dress herself, in anticipation of the arrival of Suzanne, who was to come and assist her with her bridal toilette. Laurent, on awakening, sat up in bed, and remained in that position for a few minutes, bidding farewell to his garret, which struck him as vile. At last he was to quit this kennel and have a wife. It was in the month of December, and he shivered. He sprang on the tile floor, saying to himself that he would be warm at night. A week previously, Madame Raquin, knowing how short he was of money, had slipped a purse into his hand containing 500 francs, which represented all her savings. The young man had accepted this present without difficulty, and had rigged himself out from tip to toe. Moreover, the money of the old mercer permitted him to make Thérèse the customary presents. The black trousers, dress coat, white waistcoat, shirt, and cambric tie hung spread out on a couple of chairs. Laurent washed, perfumed himself with a bottle of eau de cologne, and then proceeded to carefully attire himself. He wished to look handsome. As he fastened his collar, a collar which was high and stiff, he experienced keen pain in the neck. The button escaped from his fingers. He lost patience. The starched linen seemed to cut into his flesh. Wishing to see what was the matter, he raised his chin, and perceived the bite Camille had given him looking quite red. The collar had slightly galled the scar. Laurent pressed his lips together and turned pale. The sight of this mark seaming his neck frightened and irritated him at this moment. He crumpled up the collar and selected another, which he put on with every precaution, and then finished dressing himself. As he went downstairs, his new clothes made him look rigid. With his neck imprisoned in the inflexible linen, he dared not turn his head. At every movement he made, a pleat pinched the wound that the teeth of the drowned man had made in his flesh, and it was under the irritation of these sharp pricks that he got into the carriage, and went to fetch Thérèse to conduct her to the town hall and church. On the way, he picked up a clerk employed at the Orleans Railway Company, and old Michaud, who were to act as witnesses. When they reached the shop, everyone was ready. Grivet and Olivier, the witnesses of Thérèse, were there, along with Suzanne, who looked at the bride as little girls look at dolls they have just dressed up. Although Madame Raquin was no longer able to walk, she desired to accompany the couple everywhere, so she was hoisted into a conveyance, and the party set out. Everything passed off in a satisfactory manner at the town hall and church. The calm and modest attitude of the bride and bridegroom was remarked and approved. They pronounced the sacramental yes with an emotion that moved Grivet himself. They were as if in a dream. Whether seated or quietly kneeling side by side, they were rent by raging thoughts that flashed through their minds in spite of themselves, and they avoided looking at one another. When they seated themselves in their carriage, they seemed to be greater strangers than before. It had been decided the wedding feast should be a family affair at a little restaurant on the heights of Belleville. The Michauds and Grivet alone were invited. Until 6 in the evening the wedding party drove along the boulevards, and then repaired to the cheap eating house, where a table was spread with 7 covers in a small private room painted yellow and reeking of dust and wine. The repast was not accompanied by much gaiety. The newly married pair were grave and thoughtful. Since the morning they had been experiencing strange sensations which they did not seek to fathom. From the commencement they had felt bewildered at the rapidity with which the formalities and ceremony were performed that had just bound them together for ever. Then the long drive on the boulevards had soothed them and made them drowsy. It appeared to them that this drive lasted months. Nevertheless, they allowed themselves to be taken through the monotonous streets without displaying impatience, looking at the shops and people with sparkless eyes, overcome by a numbness that made them feel stupid, and which they endeavoured to shake off by bursting into fits of laughter. When they entered the restaurant, they were weighed down by oppressive fatigue, while increasing stupor continued to settle on them. Placed at table opposite one another, they smiled with an air of constraint, and then fell into the same heavy reverie as before, eating, answering questions, moving their limbs like machines. Amidst the idle lassitude of their minds, the same string of flying thoughts returned ceaselessly. They were married, and yet unconscious of their new condition, which caused them profound astonishment. They imagined an abyss still separated them, and at moments asked themselves how they could get over this unfathomable depth. They fancied they were living previous to the murder, when a material obstacle stood between them. Then they abruptly remembered they would occupy the same apartment that night, in a few hours, and they gazed at one another in astonishment, unable to comprehend why they should be permitted to do so. They did not feel they were united, but, on the contrary, were dreaming that they had just been violently separated, and one cast far from the other. The silly chuckling of the guests beside them, who wished to hear them talk familiarly so as to dispel all restraint, made them stammer and colour. They could never make up their minds to treat one another as sweethearts in the presence of company. Waiting had extinguished the flame that had formerly fired them. All the past had disappeared. They had forgotten their violent passion. They forgot even their joy of the morning, that profound joy they had experienced at the thought that they would no more be afraid. They were simply wearied and bewildered at all that was taking place. The events of the day turned round and round in their heads, appearing incomprehensible and monstrous. They sat there mute and smiling, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. Mingled with their dejection of spirits was a restless anxiety that proved vaguely painful. At every movement Laurent made with his neck, he felt a sharp burn devouring his flesh. His collar cut and pinched the bite of Camille. While the mayor read out to him the law bearing on marriage, while the priest spoke to him of the Almighty, at every minute of this long day he had felt the teeth of the drowned man entering his skin. At times he imagined a streak of blood was running down his chest, and would bespatter his white waistcoat with crimson. Madame Raquin was inwardly grateful to the newly married couple for their gravity. Noisy joy would have wounded the poor mother. In her mind, her son was there, invisible, handing Thérèse over to Laurent. Grivet had other ideas. He considered the wedding party sad, and wanted to enliven it, notwithstanding the looks of Michaud and Olivier, which riveted him to his chair each time he wished to get up and say something silly. Nevertheless, he managed to rise once and propose a toast. "I drink to the offspring of Monsieur and Madame," quoth he in a sprightly tone. It was necessary to touch glasses. Thérèse and Laurent had turned extremely pale on hearing this sentence. They had never dreamed that they might have children. The thought flashed through them like an icy shiver. They nervously joined glasses with the others, examining one another, surprised and alarmed to find themselves there, face to face. The party rose from table early. The guests wished to accompany the newly married pair to the nuptial chamber. It was barely 9:30 when they all returned to the shop in the arcade. The dealer in imitation jewellery was still there in her cupboard, before the box lined with blue velvet. She raised her head inquisitively, gazing at the young husband and wife with a smile. The latter caught her eyes and was terrified. It struck her that perhaps this old woman was aware of their former meetings, by having noticed Laurent slipping into the little corridor. When they all arrived on the upper floor, Thérèse withdrew almost immediately, with Madame Raquin and Suzanne, the men remaining in the dining room, while the bride performed her toilette for the night. Laurent, nerveless and depressed, did not experience the least impatience, but listened complacently to the coarse jokes of old Michaud and Grivet, who indulged themselves to their heart's content, now that the ladies were no longer present. When Suzanne and Madame Raquin quitted the nuptial apartment, and the old mercer in an unsteady voice told the young man that his wife awaited him, he started. For an instant he remained bewildered. Then he feverishly grasped the hands extended to him, and entered the room, clinging to the door like a man under the influence of drink. Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Wiesterly. Chapter 21. Laurent carefully closed the door behind him, and for a moment or two stood leaning against it, gazing round the apartment in anxiety and embarrassment. A clear fire burned on the hearth, sending large sheets of light dancing on ceiling and walls. The room was thus lit up by bright, vacillating gleams that, in a measure, annulled the effect of the lamp placed on a table in their midst. Madame Raquin had done her best to convey a coquettish aspect to the apartment. It was one mass of white and perfume throughout, as if to serve as a nest for young, fresh love. The good lady, moreover, had taken pleasure in adding a few bits of lace to the bed, and in filling the vases on the chimney-piece with bunches of roses. Gentle warmth and pleasant fragrance reigned over all, and not a sound broke the silence, save the crackling and little sharp reports of the wood aglow on the hearth. Thérèse was seated on a low chair to the right of the chimney, staring fixedly at the bright flames with her chin in her hand. She did not turn her head when Laurent entered. Clothed in a petticoat and linen night-jacket bordered with lace, she looked snowy white in the bright light of the fire. Her jacket had become disarranged, and part of her rosy shoulder appeared, half hidden by a tress of raven hair. Laurent advanced a few paces without speaking, and took off his coat and waistcoat. When he stood in his shirt-sleeves, he again looked at Thérèse, who had not moved, and he seemed to hesitate. Then, perceiving the bit of shoulder, he bent down, quivering, to press his lips to it. The young woman, abruptly turning round, withdrew her shoulder, and in doing so fixed on Laurent such a strange look of repugnance and horror, that he shrank back, troubled and ill at ease, as if himself seized with terror and disgust. Laurent then seated himself opposite Thérèse on the other side of the chimney, and they remained thus, silent and motionless, for fully 5 minutes. At times tongues of reddish flame escaped from the wood, and then the faces of the murderers were touched with fleeting gleams of blood. It was more than a couple of years since the two sweethearts had found themselves shut up alone in this room. They had arranged no love meetings since the day when Thérèse had gone to the Rue Saint-Victoire to convey to Laurent the idea of murder. Prudence had kept them apart. Barely had they, at long intervals, ventured on a pressure of the hand or a stealthy kiss. After the murder of Camille, they had restrained their passion, awaiting the nuptial night. This had at last arrived, and now they remained anxiously face to face, overcome with sudden discomfort. They had but to stretch forth their arms to clasp one another in a passionate embrace, and their arms remained lifeless, as if worn out with fatigue. The depression they had experienced during the daytime now oppressed them more and more. They observed one another with timid embarrassment, pained to remain so silent and cold. Their burning dreams ended in a peculiar reality. It sufficed that they should have succeeded in killing Camille, and have become married. It sufficed that the lips of Laurent should have grazed the shoulder of Thérèse, for their lust to be satisfied to the point of disgust and horror. In despair, they sought to find within them a little of that passion which formerly had devoured them. Their frames seemed deprived of muscles and nerves, and their embarrassment and anxiety increased. They felt ashamed of remaining so silent and gloomy face to face with one another. They would have liked to have had the strength to squeeze each other to death, so as not to pass as idiots in their own eyes. What? They belonged one to the other. They had killed a man, and played an atrocious comedy in order to be able to love in peace, and they sat there, one on either side of a mantelshelf, rigid, exhausted, their minds disturbed, and their frames lifeless. Such a denouement appeared to them horribly and cruelly ridiculous. It was then that Laurent endeavoured to speak of love, to conjure up the remembrances of other days, appealing to his imagination for a revival of his tenderness. "Thérèse," he said, "don't you recall our afternoons in this room? Then I came in by that door, but today I came in by this one. We are free now. We can make love in peace." He spoke in a hesitating, spiritless manner, and the young woman, huddled up on her low chair, continued gazing dreamily at the flame without listening. Laurent went on: "Remember how I used to dream of staying a whole night with you? I dreamed of waking up in the morning to your kisses. Now it can come true." Thérèse all at once started, as though surprised to hear a voice stammering in her ears. Turning towards Laurent, on whose countenance the fire at this moment cast a broad reddish reflection, she gazed at his sanguinary face and shuddered. The young man, more troubled and anxious, resumed: "We have succeeded, Thérèse. We have broken through all obstacles, and we belong to one another. The future is ours, is it not? A future of tranquil happiness, of satisfied love. Camille is no longer here." Laurent ceased speaking. His throat had suddenly become dry, and he was choking, unable to continue. On hearing the name of Camille, Thérèse received a violent shock. The two murderers contemplated one another, stupefied, pale, and trembling. The yellow gleams of light from the fire continued to dance on ceiling and walls. The soft odour of roses lingered in the air. The crackling of the wood broke the silence with short, sharp reports. Remembrances were abandoned. The spectre of Camille, which had been evoked, came and seated itself between the newly married pair, in front of the flaming fire. Thérèse and Laurent recognised the cold, damp smell of the drowned man in the warm air they were breathing. They said to themselves that a corpse was there, close to them, and they examined one another without daring to move. Then all the terrible story of their crime was enfolded in their memory. The name of their victim sufficed to fill them with thoughts of the past, to compel them to go through all the anguish of the murder over again. They did not open their lips, but looked at one another, and both at the same time were troubled with the same nightmare. Both with their eyes broached the same cruel tale. This exchange of terrified looks, this mute narration they were about to make to themselves of the murder, caused them keen and intolerable apprehension. The strain on their nerves threatened an attack. They might cry out, perhaps fight. Laurent, to drive away his recollections, violently tore himself from the ecstasy of horror that enthralled him in the gaze of Thérèse. He took a few strides in the room. He removed his boots and put on slippers. Then, returning to his former place, he sat down at the chimney corner, and tried to talk on matters of indifference. Thérèse, understanding what he desired, strove to answer his questions. They chatted about the weather, endeavouring to force on a commonplace conversation. Laurent said the room was warm, and Thérèse replied that nevertheless a draught came from under the small door on the staircase, and both turned in that direction with a sudden shudder. The young man hastened to speak about the roses, the fire, about everything he saw before him. The young woman, with an effort, rejoined in monosyllables, so as not to allow the conversation to drop. They had drawn back from one another, when giving themselves easy airs, endeavouring to forget whom they were, treating one another as strangers brought together by chance. But, in spite of themselves, by a strange phenomenon, whilst they uttered these empty phrases, they mutually guessed the thoughts concealed in their banal words. Do what they would, they both thought of Camille. Their eyes continued the story of the past. They still maintained by looks and mute discourse, apart from the conversation they held aloud, which ran haphazard. The words they cast here and there had no signification, being disconnected and contradictory. All their intelligence was bent on the silent exchange of their terrifying recollections. When Laurent spoke of the roses, or of the fire, of one thing or another, Thérèse was perfectly well aware that he was reminding her of the struggle in the skiff, of the dull fall of Camille; and, when Thérèse answered yes or no to an insignificant question, Laurent understood that she said she remembered or did not remember a detail of the crime. They charted it in this manner open-heartedly without needing words, while they spoke aloud of other matters. Moreover, unconscious of the syllables they pronounced, they followed their secret thoughts sentence by sentence. They might abruptly have continued their confidences aloud, without ceasing to understand each other. This sort of divination, this obstinacy of their memory in presenting to themselves without pause the image of Camille, little by little drove them crazy. They thoroughly well perceived that they guessed the thoughts of one another, and that if they did not hold their tongues, the words would rise of themselves to their mouths to name the drowned man, and describe the murder. Then they closely pinched their lips, and ceased their conversation. In the overwhelming silence that ensued, the two murderers continued to converse about their victim. It appeared to them that their eyes mutually penetrated their flesh, and buried clear, keen phrases in their bodies. At moments they fancied they heard themselves speaking aloud. Their senses changed. Sight became a sort of strange and delicate hearing. They so distinctly read their thoughts upon their countenances, that these thoughts took a peculiarly piercing sound that agitated all their organism. They could not have understood one another better had they shouted in a heartrending voice, "We have killed Camille, and his corpse is there, extended between us, making our limbs like ice." And the terrible confidence continued, more manifest, more resounding in the calm moist air of the room. Laurent and Thérèse had commenced the mute narration from the day of their first interview in the shop. Then the recollections had come one by one in order. They had related their hours of love, their moments of hesitation and anger, the terrible incident of the murder. It was then that they pinched their lips, ceasing to talk of one thing and another, in fear lest they should all at once name Camille without desiring to do so. But their thoughts failing to cease, had then led them into great distress, into the affrighted period of expectancy following the crime. They thus came to think of the corpse of the drowned man extended on a slab at the morgue. Laurent, by a look, told Thérèse all the horror he had felt, and the latter, driven to extremities, compelled by a hand of iron to part her lips, abruptly continued the conversation aloud. "You saw him at the morgue?" she inquired of Laurent without naming Camille. Laurent looked as if he expected this question. He had been reading it for a moment on the livid face of the young woman. "Yes," answered he in a choking voice. The murderers shivered, and drawing nearer the fire, extended their hands towards the flame as if an icy puff of wind had suddenly passed through the warm room. For an instant they maintained silence, coiled up like balls, cowering on their chairs. Then Thérèse in a hollow voice resumed: "Did he seem to have suffered much?" Laurent could not answer. He made a terrified gesture as if to put aside some hideous vision, and rising went towards the bed. Then, returning violently with open arms, he advanced towards Thérèse. "Kiss me," said he, extending his neck. Thérèse had risen, looking quite pale in her nightdress, and stood half thrown back with her elbow resting on the marble mantelpiece. She gazed at the neck of her husband. On the white skin she had just caught sight of a pink spot. The rush of blood to the head increased the size of this spot, turning it bright red. "Kiss me, kiss me," repeated Laurent, his face and neck scarlet. The young woman threw her head further back to avoid an embrace, and pressing the tip of her finger on the bite Camille had given her husband, addressed him thus: "What have you here? I never noticed this wound before." It seemed to Laurent as if the finger of Thérèse was boring a hole in his throat. At the contact of this finger, he suddenly started backwards, uttering a suppressed cry of pain. "That," he stammered, "that—" He hesitated, but he could not lie, and in spite of himself he told the truth. "That is the bite Camille gave me, you know, in the boat. It is nothing. It has healed. Kiss me, kiss me." And the wretch craned his neck, which was burning him. He wanted Thérèse to kiss the scar, convinced that the lips of this woman would appease the 1,000 pricks lacerating his flesh, and with raised chin he presented his extended neck for the embrace. Thérèse, who was almost lying back on the marble chimney-piece, gave a supreme gesture of disgust, and in a supplicating voice exclaimed: "Oh, no, not on that part, there's blood." She sank down on the low chair, trembling, with her forehead between her hands. Laurent remained where he stood for a moment, looking stupid. Then, all at once, with the clutch of a wild beast, he grasped the head of Thérèse in his two great hands, and by force brought her lips to the bite he had received from Camille on his neck. For an instant he crushed this head of a woman against his skin. Thérèse had given way, uttering hollow groans. She was choking on the neck of Laurent. When she had freed herself from his hands, she violently wiped her mouth and spat in the fire. She had not said a word. Laurent, ashamed of his brutality, began walking slowly from the bed to the window. Suffering alone, the horrible burn had made him exact a kiss from Thérèse, and when her frigid lips met the scorching scar, he felt the pain more acutely. This kiss obtained by violence had just crushed him. The shock had been so painful that for nothing in the world would he have received another. He cast his eyes upon the woman with whom he was to live, and who sat, shuddering, doubled up before the fire, turning her back to him, and he repeated to himself that he no longer loved this woman, and that she no longer loved him. For nearly an hour Thérèse maintained her dejected attitude, while Laurent silently walked backward and forward. Both inwardly acknowledged with terror that their passion was dead, that they had killed it in killing Camille. The embers on the hearth were gently dying out. A sheet of bright, clear fire shone above the ashes. Little by little, the heat of the room had become stifling. The flowers were fading, making the thick air sickly with their heavy odour. Laurent all at once had an hallucination. As he turned round, coming from the window to the bed, he saw Camille in a dark corner, between the chimney and wardrobe. The face of his victim looked greenish and distorted, just as he had seen it on the slab at the morgue. He remained glued to the carpet, fainting, leaning against a piece of furniture for support. At a hollow rattle in his throat, Thérèse raised her head. "There, there!" exclaimed Laurent in a terrified tone. With extended arm he pointed to the dark corner where he perceived the sinister face of Camille. Thérèse, infected by his terror, went and pressed against him. "It is his portrait," she murmured in an undertone, as if the face of her late husband could hear her. "His portrait?" repeated Laurent, whose hair stood on end. "Yes, you know, the painting you did," she replied. "My aunt was to have removed it to her room. No doubt she forgot to take it down." "Really, his portrait?" said he. The murderer had some difficulty in recognising the canvas. In his trouble he forgot that it was he who had drawn those clashing strokes, who had spread on those dirty tints that now terrified him. Terror made him see the picture as it was, vile, wretchedly put together, muddy, displaying the grimacing face of a corpse on a black ground. His own work astonished and crushed him by its atrocious ugliness, particularly the two eyes, which seemed floating in soft yellowish orbits, reminding him exactly of the decomposed eyes of the drowned man at the morgue. For a moment he remained breathless, thinking Thérèse was telling an untruth to allay his fears. Then he distinguished the frame, and little by little became calm. "Go and take it down," said he in a very low tone to the young woman. "Oh, no, I'm afraid," she answered with a shiver. Laurent began to tremble again. At moments the frame of the picture disappeared, and he only saw the two white eyes giving him a long steady look. "I beg you to go and unhook it," said he, beseeching his companion. "No, no," she replied. "We will turn it to face the wall, and then it will not frighten us," he suggested. "No," said she, "I cannot do it." The murderer, cowardly and humble, thrust the young woman towards the canvas, hiding behind her so as to escape the gaze of the drowned man. But she escaped, and he wanted to brazen the matter out. Approaching the picture, he raised his hand in search of the nail, but the portrait gave such a long, crushing, ignoble look, that Laurent, after seeking to stare it out, found himself vanquished, and started back overpowered, murmuring as he did so, "No, you are right, Thérèse, we cannot do it. Your aunt shall take it down tomorrow." He resumed his walk up and down with bowed head, feeling the portrait was staring at him, following him with its eyes. At times he could not prevent himself casting a side glance at the canvas, and then in the depth of the darkness he still perceived the dull, deadened eyes of the drowned man. The thought that Camille was there, in a corner, watching him, present on his wedding night, examining Thérèse and himself, ended by driving him mad with terror and despair. One circumstance which would have brought a smile to the lips of anyone else made him completely lose his head. As he stood before the fire, he heard a sort of scratching sound. He turned pale, imagining it came from the portrait, that Camille was descending from his frame. Then he discovered that the noise was at the small door opening on the staircase, and he looked at Thérèse, who also showed signs of fear. "There is someone on the staircase," he murmured. "Who can be coming that way?" The young woman gave no answer. Both were thinking of the drowned man, and their temples became moist with icy perspiration. They sought refuge together at the end of the room, expecting to see the door suddenly open and the corpse of Camille fall on the floor. As the sound continued, but more sharply and irregularly, they thought their victim must be tearing away the wood with his nails to get in. For the space of nearly 5 minutes they dared not stir. Finally a mewing was heard, and Laurent, advancing, recognised the tabby cat belonging to Madame Raquin, which had been accidentally shut up in the room, and was endeavouring to get out by clawing at the door. François, frightened by Laurent, sprang upon a chair at a bound. With hair on end and stiffened paws, he looked his new master in the face in a harsh and cruel manner. The young man did not like cats, and François almost terrified him. In this moment of excitement and alarm, he imagined the cat was about to fly in his face to avenge Camille. He fancied the beast must know everything, that there were thoughts in his strangely dilated round eyes. The fixed gaze of the animal caused Laurent to lower his lids. As he was about to give François a kick, Thérèse exclaimed, "Don't hurt him." This sentence produced a strange impression on Laurent, and an absurd idea got into his head. "Camille has entered into this cat," thought he. "I shall have to kill the beast. It looks like a human being." He refrained from giving the kick, being afraid of hearing François speak to him with the voice of Camille. Then he said to himself that this animal knew too much, and that he should have to throw it out of the window. But he had not the pluck to accomplish his design. François maintained a fighting attitude. With claws extended and back curved in sullen irritation, he followed the least movement of his enemy with superb tranquillity. The metallic sparkle of his eyes troubled Laurent, who hastened to open the dining room door, and the cat fled with a shrill mew. Thérèse had again seated herself before the extinguished fire. Laurent resumed his walk from bed to window. It was thus that they awaited daylight. They did not think of going to bed. Their hearts were thoroughly dead. They had but one single desire: to leave the room they were in, and where they were choking. They experienced a real discomfort in being shut up together, and in breathing the same atmosphere. They would have liked someone to be there, to interrupt their privacy, to drag them from the cruel embarrassment in which they found themselves, sitting one before the other without opening their lips, and unable to resuscitate their love. Their long silences tortured them, silence loaded with bitter and despairing complaints, with mute reproaches, which they distinctly heard in the tranquil air. Day came at last, a dirty, whitish dawn, bringing penetrating cold with it. When the room had filled with dim light, Laurent, who was shivering, felt calmer. He looked the portrait of Camille straight in the face, and saw it as it was, commonplace and puerile. He took it down, and shrugging his shoulders, called himself a fool. Thérèse had risen from the low chair, and was tumbling the bed about for the purpose of deceiving her aunt, so as to make her believe they had passed a happy night. "Look here," Laurent brutally remarked to her, "I hope we shall sleep well tonight. There must be an end to this sort of childishness." Thérèse cast a deep, grave glance at him. "You understand," he continued, "I did not marry for the purpose of passing sleepless nights. We are just like children. It was you who disturbed me with your ghostly airs. Tonight you will try to be gay and not frighten me." He forced himself to laugh without knowing why he did so. "I will try," gloomily answered the young woman. Such was the wedding night of Thérèse and Laurent. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 22. The following nights proved still more cruel. The murderers had wished to pass this part of the 24 hours together, so as to be able to defend themselves against the drowned man, and, By a strange effect, since they had been doing so, they shuddered the more. They were exasperated and their nerves so irritated that they underwent atrocious attacks of suffering and terror at the exchange of a simple word or look. At the slightest conversation between them, at the least talk they had alone, they began raving and were ready to draw blood. The sort of remorse Laurent experienced was purely physical. His body, his irritated nerves and trembling frame alone were afraid of the drowned man. His conscience was for nothing in his terror. He did not feel the least regret at having killed Camille. When he was calm, when the spectre did not happen to be there, he would have committed the murder over again, had he thought his interests absolutely required it. During the daytime he laughed at himself for his fright, making up his mind to be stronger, and he harshly rebuked Thérèse, whom he accused of troubling him. According to what he said, it was Thérèse who shuddered, it was Thérèse alone who brought on the frightful scenes at night in the bedroom, and as soon as night came, as soon as he found himself shut in with his wife, icy perspiration purled on his skin, and his frame shook with childish terror. He thus underwent intermittent nervous attacks that returned nightly, and threw his senses into confusion, while showing him the hideous green face of his victim. These attacks resembled the accesses of some frightful illness, a sort of hysteria of murder. The name of illness, of nervous affection, was really the only one to give to the terror that Laurent experienced. His face became convulsed, his limbs rigid, his nerves could be seen knotting beneath his skin. The body suffered horribly, while the spirit remained absent. The wretch felt no repentance. His passion for Thérèse had conveyed a frightful evil to him, and that was all. Thérèse also found herself a prey to these heavy shocks, but in her terror she showed herself a woman. She felt vague remorse, unavowed regret. She, at times, had an inclination to cast herself on her knees and beseech the spectre of Camille to pardon her, while swearing to appease it by repentance. Maybe Laurent perceived these acts of cowardice on the part of Thérèse, for when they were agitated by the common terror, he laid the blame on her, and treated her with brutality. On the first nights, they were unable to go to bed. They waited for daylight, seated before the fire, or pacing to and fro as on the evening of the wedding day. The thought of lying down, side by side, on the bed, caused them a sort of terrifying repugnance. By tacit consent they avoided kissing one another, and they did not even look at their couch, which Thérèse tumbled about in the morning. When overcome with fatigue, they slept for an hour or two in the armchairs, to awaken with a start, under the influence of the sinister denouement of some nightmare. On awakening with limbs stiff and tired, shivering all over with discomfort and cold, their faces marbled with livid blotches, they contemplated one another in bewilderment, astonished to see themselves there, and they displayed strange bashfulness towards each other, ashamed at showing their disgust and terror. But they struggled against sleep as much as they could. They seated themselves, one on each side of the chimney, and talked of 1,000 trifles, being very careful not to let the conversation drop. There was a broad space between them in front of the fire. When they turned their heads, they imagined that Camille had drawn a chair there, and occupied this space, warming his feet in a lugubrious bantering fashion. This vision, which they had seen on the evening of their wedding day, returned each night. And this corpse taking a mute but jeering part in their interviews, this horribly disfigured body ever remaining there, overwhelmed them with continued anxiety. Not daring to move, they half blinded themselves staring at the scorching flames, and, when unable to resist any longer, they cast a timid glance aside. Their eyes, irritated by the glowing coal, created the vision, and conveyed to it a reddish glow. Laurent, in the end, refused to remain seated any longer, without avowing the cause of this whim to Thérèse. The latter understood that he must see Camille as she saw him, and, in her turn, she declared that the heat made her feel ill, and that she would be more comfortable a few steps away from the chimney. Pushing back her armchair to the foot of the bed, she remained there overcome, while her husband resumed his walk in the room. From time to time he opened the window, allowing the icy air of the cold January night to fill the apartment, and this calmed his fever. For a week the newly married couple passed the nights in this fashion, dozing and getting a little rest in the daytime, Thérèse behind the counter in the shop, Laurent in his office. At night they belonged to pain and fear. And the strangest part of the whole business was the attitude they maintained towards each other. They did not utter one word of love, but feigned to have forgotten the past, and seemed to accept, to tolerate one another like sick people, feeling secret pity for their mutual sufferings. Both hoped to conceal their disgust and fear, and neither seemed to think of the peculiar nights they passed, which should have enlightened them as to the real state of their beings. When they sat up until morning, barely exchanging a word, turning pale at the least sound, they looked as if they thought all newly married folk conducted themselves in the same way during the first days of their marriage. This was the clumsy hypocrisy of two fools. They were soon so overcome by weariness that they one night decided to lie on the bed. They did not undress, but threw themselves, as they were, on the quilt, feeling lest their bare skins should touch, for they fancied they would receive a painful shock at the least contact. Then, when they had slept thus in an anxious sleep for 2 nights, they risked removing their clothes and slipping between the sheets. But they remained apart, and took all sorts of precautions so as not to come together. Thérèse got into bed first, and lay down close to the wall. Laurent waited until she had made herself quite comfortable, and then ventured to stretch himself out at the opposite end of the mattress, so that there was a broad space between them. It was there that the corpse of Camille lay. When the two murderers were extended under the same sheet, and had closed their eyes, they fancied they felt the damp corpse of their victim lying in the middle of the bed, and turning their flesh icy cold. It was like a vile obstacle separating them. They were seized with fever and delirium, and this obstacle in their minds became material. They touched the corpse. They saw it spread out like a greenish and dissolved shred of something, and they inhaled the infectious odour of this lump of human putrefaction. All their senses were in a state of hallucination, conveying intolerable acuteness to their sensations. The presence of this filthy bedfellow kept them motionless, silent, abstracted with anguish. Laurent, at times, thought of taking Thérèse violently in his arms, but he dared not move. He said to himself that he could not extend his hand without getting it full of the soft flesh of Camille. Next, he fancied that the drowned man came to sleep between them so as to prevent them clasping one another, and he ended by understanding that Camille was jealous. Nevertheless, ever and anon, they sought to exchange a timid kiss to see what would happen. The young man jeered at his wife, and ordered her to embrace him. But their lips were so cold that it seemed as if the dead man had got between their mouths. Both felt disgusted. Thérèse shuddered with horror, and Laurent, who heard her teeth chattering, railed at her. "Why are you trembling?" he exclaimed. "Are you afraid of Camille? Ah! The poor man is as dead as a doornail at this moment." Both avoided saying what made them shudder. When an hallucination brought the countenance of the drowned man before Thérèse, she closed her eyes, keeping her terror to herself, not daring to speak to her husband of her vision, lest she should bring on a still more terrible crisis. And it was just the same with Laurent. When driven to extremities, he, in a fit of despair, accused Thérèse of being afraid of Camille. The name, uttered aloud, occasioned additional anguish. The murderer raved. "Yes, yes," he stammered, addressing the young woman. "You are afraid of Camille. I can see that plain enough. You are a silly thing. You have no pluck at all. Look here, just go to sleep quietly. Do you think your husband will come and pull you out of bed by the heels, because I happen to be sleeping with you?" This idea that the drowned man might come and pull them out of bed by their heels made the hair of Laurent stand on end, and he continued with greater violence while still in the utmost terror himself. "I shall have to take you some night to the cemetery. We will open the coffin Camille is in, and you will see what he looks like. Then you will perhaps cease being afraid. Go on, he doesn't know we threw him in the water." Thérèse, with her head under the bedclothes, was uttering smothered groans. "We threw him into the water because he was in our way," resumed her husband, "and we'll throw him in again, will we not? Don't act like a child. Show a little strength. It's silly to trouble our happiness. You see, my dear, when we are dead and underground, we shall be neither less nor more happy because we cast an idiot in the Seine, when we shall have freely enjoyed our love, which will have been an advantage. Come, give me a kiss." The young woman kissed him, but she was icy cold and half crazy, while he shuddered as much as she did. For a fortnight Laurent was asking himself how he could kill Camille again. He had flung him in the water, and yet he was not dead enough, because he came every night to sleep in the bed of Thérèse, while the murderers thought that having committed the crime, they could love one another in peace. Their resuscitated victim arrived to make their touch like ice. Thérèse was not a widow. Laurent found that he was mated to a woman who already had a drowned man for husband. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 23. Little by little, Laurent became furiously mad and resolved to drive Camille from his bed. He had first of all slept with his clothes on. Then he had avoided touching Thérèse. In rage and despair, he wanted at last to take his wife in his arms and crush the spectre of his victim rather than leave her to it. This was a superb revolt of brutality. The hope that the kisses of Thérèse would cure him of his insomnia had alone brought him into the room of the young woman. When he had found himself there, in the position of master, he had become a prey to such atrocious attacks that it had not even occurred to him to attempt the cure. And he had remained overwhelmed for 3 weeks, without remembering that he had done everything to obtain Thérèse, and now that she was in his possession, he could not touch her without increased suffering. His excessive anguish drew him from this state of dejection. In the first moment of stupor, amid the strange discouragement of the wedding night, he had forgotten the reasons that had urged him to marry. But his repeated bad dreams had aroused in him a feeling of sullen irritation, which triumphed over his cowardice and restored his memory. He remembered he had married in order to drive away nightmare by pressing his wife closely to his breast. Then, one night, he abruptly took Thérèse in his arms, and, at the risk of passing over the corpse of the drowned man, drew her violently to him. The young woman, who was also driven to extremes, would have cast herself into the fire had she thought that flames would have purified her flesh and delivered her from woe. She returned Laurent his advances, determined to be either consumed by the caresses of this man or to find relief in them. And they clasped one another in a hideous embrace. Pain and horror took the place of love. When their limbs touched, it was like falling on live coal. They uttered a cry, pressing still closer together so as not to leave room for the drowned man. But they still felt the shreds of Camille, which were ignobly squeezed between them, freezing their skins in parts, whilst in others they were burning hot. Their kisses were frightfully cruel. Thérèse sought the bite that Camille had given in the stiff, swollen neck of Laurent, and passionately pressed her lips to it. There was the raw sore, this wound once healed, and the murderers would sleep in peace. The young woman understood this, and she endeavoured to cauterize the bad place with the fire of her caresses. But she scorched her lips, and Laurent thrust her violently away, giving a dismal groan. It seemed to him that she was pressing a red-hot iron to his neck. Thérèse, half mad, came back. She wanted to kiss the scar again. She experienced a keenly voluptuous sensation in placing her mouth on this piece of skin wherein Camille had buried his teeth. At one moment she thought of biting her husband in the same place, of tearing away a large piece of flesh, of making a fresh and deeper wound that would remove the trace of the old one. And she said to herself that she would no more turn pale when she saw the marks of her own teeth. But Laurent shielded his neck from her kisses. The smarting pain he experienced was too acute, and each time his wife presented her lips, he pushed her back. They struggled in this manner with a rattling in their throats, writhing in the horror of their caresses. They distinctly felt that they only increased their suffering. They might well strain one another in these terrible clasps. They cried out with pain, they burnt and bruised each other, but were unable to calm their frightfully excited nerves. Each strain rendered their disgust more intense. While exchanging these ghastly embraces, They were a prey to the most terrible hallucinations, imagining that the drowned man was dragging them by the heels and violently jerking the bedstead. For a moment they let one another go, feeling repugnance and invincible nervous agitation. Then they determined not to be conquered. They clasped each other again in a fresh embrace, and once more were obliged to separate, for it seemed as if red-hot bradawls were entering their limbs. At several intervals they attempted in this way to overcome their disgust, by tiring, by wearing out their nerves. And each time their nerves became irritated and strained, causing them such exasperation that they would perhaps have died of enervation had they remained in the arms of one another. This battle against their own bodies excited them to madness, and they obstinately sought to gain the victory. Finally, a more acute crisis exhausted them. They received a shock of such incredible violence that they thought they were about to have a fit. Cast back, one on each side of the bed, burning and bruised, they began to sob, and amidst their tears they seemed to hear the triumphant laughter of the drowned man, who again slid chuckling under the sheet. They had been unable to drive him from the bed and were vanquished. Camille gently stretched himself between them, whilst Laurent deplored his want of power to thrust him away, and Thérèse trembled lest the corpse should have the idea of taking advantage of the victory to press her, in his turn, in his arms, in the quality of legitimate master. They had made a supreme effort. In face of their defeat, they understood that, in future, they did not exchange the smallest kiss. What they had attempted, in order to drive away their terror, had plunged them into greater fright. And, as they felt the chill of the corpse, which was now to separate them for ever, they shed bitter tears, asking themselves, with anguish, what would become of them. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Therese Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Visitelli. Chapter 24. In accordance with the hopes of old Michaud, when doing his best to bring about the marriage of Thérèse and Laurent, the Thursday evenings resumed their former gaiety, as soon as the wedding was over. These evenings were in great peril after the time of the death of Camille. The guests came, in fear, into this house of mourning. Each week they were trembling with anxiety, lest they should be definitely dismissed. The idea that the door of the shop would no doubt at last be closed to them terrified Michaud and Grivet, who clung to their habits with the instinct and obstinacy of brutes. They said to themselves that the old woman and young widow could one day go and weep over the defunct at Vernon or elsewhere, and then, on Thursday nights, they would not know what to do. In the mind's eye, they saw themselves wandering about the arcade in a lamentable fashion, dreaming of colossal gains at dominoes. Pending the advent of these bad times, they timidly enjoyed their final moments of happiness, arriving with an anxious, sugary air at the shop, and repeating to themselves on each occasion that they would perhaps return no more. For over a year they were beset with these fears. In face of the tears of Madame Raquin and the silence of Thérèse, they dared not make themselves at ease and laugh. They felt they were no longer at home as in the time of Camille. It seemed, so to say, that they were still in every evening they passed seated at the dining-room table. It was in these desperate circumstances that the egotism of Michaud urged him to strike a masterly stroke by finding a husband for the widow of the drowned man. On the Thursday following the marriage, Grivet and Michaud made a triumphant entry into the dining-room. They had conquered. The dining-room belonged to them again. They no longer feared dismissal. They came there as happy people, stretching out their legs, and cracking their former jokes, one after the other. It could be seen from their delighted and confident attitude that, in their idea, a revolution had been accomplished. All recollection of Camille had been dispelled. The dead husband, a spectre that cast a chill over everyone, had been driven away by the living husband. The past and its joys were resuscitated. Laurent took the place of Camille, All cause for sadness disappeared. The guests could now laugh without grieving anyone, and indeed it was their duty to laugh to cheer up this worthy family who were good enough to receive them. Henceforth, Grivet and Michaud, who for nearly 18 months had visited the house under the pretext of consoling Madame Raquin, could set their little hypocrisy aside, and frankly come and doze opposite one another to the sharp ring of the dominoes. And each week brought a Thursday evening. Each week those lifeless and grotesque heads which formerly had exasperated Thérèse assembled round the table. The young woman talked of showing these folk the door. Their bursts of foolish laughter and silly reflections irritated her, but Lauren made her understand that such a step would be a mistake. It was necessary that the present should resemble the past as much as possible, and, above all, they must preserve the friendship of the police, of those idiots who protected them from all suspicion. Thérèse gave way. The guests were well received, and they viewed with delight a future full of a long string of warm Thursday evenings. It was about this time that the lives of the couple became, in a way, divided in two. In the morning, when they drove away the terror of night, Laurent hastily dressed himself, but he only recovered his ease and egotistic calm when in the dining room, seated before an enormous bowl of coffee and milk, which Thérèse prepared for him, Madame Raquin, who had become even more feeble and could barely get down to the shop, watched him eating with a maternal smile. He swallowed the toast, filled his stomach, and little by little became tranquilized. After the coffee, he drank a small glass of brandy, which completely restored him. Then he said "Goodbye" to Madame Raquin and Thérèse, without ever kissing them, and strolled to his office. Spring was at hand. The trees along the quays were becoming covered with leaves, with light, pale green lacework. The river rang with caressing sounds below. Above, the first sunny rays of the year shed gentle warmth. Laurent felt himself another man in the fresh air. He freely inhaled this breath of young life descending from the skies of April and May. He saw the sun, halting to watch the silvery reflection streaking the Seine, listening to the sounds on the quays, allowing the acrid odours of early day to penetrate him, enjoying the clear, delightful morning. He certainly thought very little about Camille. Sometimes he listlessly contemplated the march on the other side of the water, and his mind then reverted to his victim. Like a man of courage might think of a silly fright that had come over him. With a stomach full and face refreshed, he recovered his thick-headed tranquillity. He reached his office, and passed the whole day gaping and awaiting the time to leave. He was a mere clerk like the others, stupid and weary, without an idea in his head, save that of sending in his resignation and taking a studio. He dreamed vaguely of a new existence of idleness, and this sufficed to occupy him until evening. Thoughts of the shop in the arcade never troubled him. At night, after longing for the hour of release since the morning, he left his office with regret, and followed the quays again, secretly troubled and anxious. However slowly he walked, he had to enter the shop at last, and there terror awaited him. Thérèse experienced the same sensations. So long as Laurent was not beside her, she felt at ease. She had dismissed her charwoman, saying that everything was in disorder, and the shop and apartment filthy dirty. She all at once had ideas of tidiness. The truth was that she felt the necessity of moving about, of doing something, of exercising her stiff limbs. She went hither and thither all the morning, sweeping, dusting, cleaning the rooms, washing up the plates and dishes, doing work that could have disgusted her formerly. These household duties kept her on her feet, active and silent until noon, without allowing her time to think of aught else than the cup was hanging from the ceiling and the greasy plates. On the stroke of 12, she went to the kitchen to prepare lunch. At table, Madame Raquin was pained to see her always rising to fetch the dishes. She was touched and annoyed at the activity displayed by her niece. She scolded her, and Thérèse replied that it was necessary to economize. When the meal was over, the young woman dressed, and at last decided to join her aunt behind the counter. There sleep overtook her. Worn out by her restless nights, she dozed off, yielding to the voluptuous feeling of drowsiness that gained her, as soon as she sat down. These were only light spells of heaviness, replete with vague charm that calmed her nerves. The thoughts of Camille left her. She enjoyed that tranquil repose of invalids who are all at once freed from pain. She felt relief in body, her mind free. She sank into a gentle and repairing state of nothingness. Deprived of these few calm moments, she would have broken down under the tension of her nervous system. These spells of somnolence gave her strength to suffer again, and become terrified the ensuing night. As a matter of fact, she did not sleep. She barely closed her lids, and was lost in a dream of peace. When a customer entered, she opened her eyes, served the few sous worth of articles asked for, and fell back into the floating reverie. In this manner she passed 3 or 4 hours of perfect happiness, answering her aunt in monosyllables, and yielding with real enjoyment to these moments of unconsciousness which relieved her of her thoughts, and completely overcame her. She barely, at long intervals, cast a glance into the arcade, and was particularly at her ease in cloudy weather, when it was dark and she could conceal her lassitude in the gloom. The damp and disgusting arcade, crossed by a lot of wretched drenched pedestrians, whose umbrellas dripped upon the tiles, seemed to her like an alley in a low quarter, a sort of dirty, sinister corridor, where no one would come to seek and trouble her. At moments, when she saw the dull gleams of light that hung around her, when she smelled the bitter odour of the dampness, she imagined she had just been buried alive, that she was underground, at the bottom of a common grave swarming with death. At this thought consoled and appeased her, for she said to herself that she was now in security, that she was about to die and would suffer no more. But sometimes she had to keep her eyes open. Suzanne paid her a visit, and remained embroidering near the counter all the afternoon. The wife of Olivier, with her pouty face and slow movements, now pleased Thérèse, who experienced strange relief in observing this poor broken-up creature, and had made a friend of her. She loved to see her at her side, smiling with her faint smile, more dead than alive, and bringing into the shop the stuffy odour of the cemetery. When the blue eyes of Suzanne, transparent as glass, rested fixedly on those of Thérèse, the latter experienced a beneficent chill in the marrow of her bones. Thérèse remained thus until 4 o'clock, when she returned to the kitchen, and there again sought fatigue, preparing dinner for Laurent with febrile haste. But when her husband appeared on the threshold, she felt a tightening in the throat, and all her being once more became a prey to anguish. Each day the sensations of the couple were practically the same. During the daytime, when they were not face to face, they enjoyed delightful hours of repose. At night, as soon as they came together, both experienced poignant discomfort. The evenings, nevertheless, were calm. Thérèse and Laurent, who shuddered at the thought of going to their room, sat up as long as possible. Madame Raquin, reclining in a great armchair, was placed between them, and chatted in her placid voice. She spoke of Vernon, still thinking of her son, but avoiding to mention him for a sort of feeling of diffidence for the others. She smiled at her dear children, and formed plans for their future. The lamp shed its faint gleams on her white face, and her words sounded particularly sweet in the silence and stillness of the room. The murderers, one seated on each side of her, silent and motionless, seemed to be attentively listening to what she said. In truth, they did not attempt to follow the sense of the gossip of the good old lady. They were simply pleased to hear the sound of soft words which prevented them attending the crash of their own thoughts. They dared not cast their eyes on one another, but looked at Madame Raquin to give themselves countenance. They never breathed a word about going to bed. They could have remained there until morning, listening to the affectionate nonsense of the former mercer, amid the appeasement she spread around her, had she not herself expressed the desire to retire. It was only then that they quitted the dining room and entered their own apartment in despair, as if casting themselves to the bottom of an abyss. But they soon had a much more preference for the Thursday gatherings than for these family evenings, when along with Madame Raquin they were unable to divert their thoughts. The feeble voice of their aunt and her tender gaiety did not stifle the cries that lacerated them. They could feel bedtime coming on, and they shuddered when their eyes caught sight of the door of the room. Awaiting the moment when they could be alone became more and more cruel as the evening advanced. On Thursday night, on the contrary, they were giddy with folly, one forgot the prison of the other, and they suffered less. Thérèse ended by heartily longing for the reception days. Had Michaud and Grivet not arrived, she would have gone and fetched them. When strangers were in the dining room between herself and Laurent, she felt more calm. She would have liked to always have guests there, to hear a noise, something to divert her and detach her from her thoughts. In the presence of other people, she displayed a sort of nervous gaiety. Laurent also recovered his previous merriment, returning to his coarse peasant jest, his hoarse laughter, his practical jokes of a former canvas dauber. Never had these gatherings been so gay and noisy. It was thus that Laurent and Thérèse could remain face to face once a week without shuddering. But they were soon beset with further anxiety. Paralysis was little by little gaining on Madame Raquin, and they foresaw the day when she could be reburied to her armchair, feeble and doltish. The poor old lady already began to stammer fragments of disjointed phrases. Her voice was growing weaker, and her limbs were one by one losing their vitality. She was becoming a thing. It was with terror that Thérèse and Laurent observed the breaking up of this being who still separated them, and whose voice drew them for their bad dreams. When the old mercer lost her intelligence and remained stiff and silent in her armchair, they could find themselves alone, and in the evening would no longer be able to escape the dreadful face-to-face conversation. Then their terror could commence at 6 o'clock instead of midnight. It could drive them mad. They made every effort to give Madame Raquin that health which had become so necessary to them. They called in doctors, and bestowed on the patient all sorts of little attentions. Even this occupation of nurses caused them to forget, and afforded them an appeasement that encouraged them to double in zeal. They did not wish to lose a third party, who rendered their evenings supportable, and they did not wish the dining room and the whole house to become a cruel and sinister spot like the room. Madame Raquin was singularly touched at the assiduous care they took of her. She applauded herself, amid tears, at having united them, and at having abandoned to them her 40,000 francs. Never, since the death of her son, had she counted on so much affection in her final moments. Her old age was quite softened by the tenderness of her dear children. She did not feel the implacable paralysis which, in spite of all, made her more and more rigid day by day. Nevertheless, Thérèse and Laurent continued to lead their double existence. In each of them there were like two distinct beings, a nervous, terrified being who shuddered as soon as dusk set in, and a torpid, forgetful being who breathed at ease when the sun rose. They lived two lives, crying out in anguish when alone, and peacefully smiling in company. Never did their face, in public, show the slightest trace of the sufferings that had reached them in private. They appeared calm and happy, and instinctively concealed their troubles. To see them so tranquil in the daytime, no one would have suspected the hallucination that tortured them every night. They would have been taken for a couple blessed by heaven, and living in the enjoyment of full felicity. Grivet Gallery called them the turtle doves. He jested about their fatigued looks. Laurent and Thérèse very turned pale, and even succeeded in forcing on a smile. They became accustomed to the naughty jokes of the old clerk. So long as they remained in the dining room, they were able to keep their terror under control. The mind could not imagine the frightful change that came over them as soon as they were shut up in their bedroom. On the Thursday night particularly, this transformation was so violently brutal. that is seen as if accomplished in a supernatural world. The drama in the bedroom, by its strangeness, by its savage passion, surpassed all belief, and remained deeply concealed within their aging beings. Had they spoken of it, they would have been taken for mad. "How happy those sweethearts are!" frequently remarked old Michaud. "They hardly say a word, but that does not prevent them thinking. I bet they devour one another with kisses when we have gone." Such was the opinion of the company. Thérèse and Laurent came to be spoken of as a model couple. All the tenants in the Arcade of the Pont Neuf extolled affection, the tranquil happiness, the everlasting honeymoon of the married pair. They alone knew that the corpse of Camille slept between them. They alone felt, beneath the calm exterior of their faces, the nervous contraction that, at night, horribly distorted the features, and changed the placid expression of their physiognomies into hideous masks of pain. End of the chapter 24 of Therese Raquin, recorded by David Muñiz in Madrid, Spain, from Lavapiés.
Chapter 25 of Therese Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 25. At the expiration of 4 months, Laurent thought of taking advantage of the profit he had calculated on deriving from his marriage. He would have abandoned his wife and fled from the spectre of Camille 3 days after the wedding, had not his interest detained him at the shop in the Arcade. He accepted his nights of terror. He remained in the anguish that was choking him, so as not to be deprived of the benefit of his crime. If he parted from Thérèse, he would again be plunged in poverty, and be forced to retain his post. By remaining with her, he would, on the contrary, be able to satisfy his inclination for idleness, and to live liberally, doing nothing, on the revenue Madame Raquin had placed in the name of his wife. Very likely he would have fled with the 40,000 francs, had he been able to realize them. But the old mercer, on the advice of Michaud, had shown the prudence to protect the interests of her niece in the marriage contract. Laurent, in this manner, found himself attached to Thérèse by a powerful bond. As a set-off against his atrocious nights, he determined at least to be kept in blissful laziness, well fed, warmly clothed, and provided with the necessary cash in his pocket to satisfy his whims. At this price alone would he consent to sleep with the corpse of the drowned man. One evening he announced to Madame Raquin and his wife that he had sent in his resignation, and would quit his office at the end of a fortnight. Thérèse gave a gesture of anxiety. He hastened to add that he intended taking a small studio, where he would go on with his painting. He spoke at length about the annoyance of his employment, and the broad horizons that art opened to him. Now that he had a few sous, and could make a bid for success, he wished to see whether he was not capable of great achievements. The speech he made on this subject simply concealed a ferocious desire to resume his former studio life. Thérèse sat with pinched lips without replying. She had no idea of allowing Laurent to squander the small fortune that assured her liberty. When her husband pressed her with questions in view of obtaining her consent, she answered curtly, giving him to understand that if he left his office he would no longer be earning any money, and would be living entirely at her expense. But, as she spoke, Laurent observed her so keenly that he troubled her, and arrested on her lips the refusal she was about to utter. She fancied she read in the eyes of her accomplice this menacing threat: "If you do not consent, I shall reveal everything." She began to stammer, and Madame Raquin exclaimed that the desire of her dear son was no more than what was just, and that they must give him the means to become a man of talent. The good lady spoilt Laurent as she had spoilt Camille. Quite mollified by the caresses the young man lavished on her, she belonged to him, and never failed to take his part. It was therefore decided that Laurent should have a studio, and receive 100 francs a month pocket money. The budget of the family was arranged in this way. The profits realized in the mercery business would pay the rent of the shop and apartment, and the balance would almost suffice for the daily expenses of the family. Laurent would receive the rent of his studio and his 100 francs a month, out of the 2,000 and a few hundred francs income from the funded money, the remainder going into the general purse. In that way the capital would remain intact. This arrangement somewhat tranquilized Thérèse, who nevertheless made her husband swear that he would never go beyond the sum allowed him. But as to that matter, she said to herself that Laurent could not get possession of the 40,000 francs without her signature, and she was thoroughly determined that she would never place her name to any document. On the morrow, Laurent took a small studio in the lower part of the Rue Mazarine, which his eye had been fixed on for a month. He did not mean to leave his office without having a refuge where he could quietly pass his days far away from Thérèse. At the end of the fortnight he bade adieu to his colleagues. Grivet was stupefied at his departure. A young man, said he, who had such a brilliant future before him, a young man who in the space of 4 years had reached a salary that he, Grivet, had taken 20 years to attain. Laurent stupefied him still more when he told him he was going to give his whole time to painting. At last the artist installed himself in his studio, which was a sort of square loft about 7 or 8 yards long by the same breadth. The ceiling, which inclined abruptly in a rapid slope, was pierced by a large window conveying a white raw light to the floor and blackish walls. The sounds in the street did not ascend so high. This silent, wan room, opening above on the sky, resembled a hole or a vault dug out of grey clay. Laurent furnished the place anywise. He brought a couple of chairs with holes in the rush seats, a table that he set against the wall so that it might not slip down, an old kitchen dresser, his colour box and easel. All the luxury in the place consisted of a spacious divan which he purchased for 30 francs from a second-hand dealer. He remained a fortnight without even thinking of touching his brushes. He arrived between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, smoked, stretched himself on the divan, and awaited noon, delighted that it was morning, and that he had many hours of daylight before him. At 12 he went to lunch. As soon as the meal was over, he hastened back, to be alone, and get away from the pale face of Thérèse. He next went through the process of digestion, sleeping spread out on the divan until evening. His studio was an abode of peace where he did not tremble. One day his wife asked him if she might visit his dear refuge. He refused, and as, notwithstanding his refusal, she came and knocked at the door, he refrained from opening to her, telling her in the evening that he had spent the day at the Louvre Museum. He was afraid that Thérèse might bring the spectre of Camille with her. Idleness ended by weighing heavily on his shoulders, so he purchased a canvas and colours, and set to work. As he had not sufficient money to pay models, he resolved to paint according to fancy, without troubling about nature, and he began the head of a man. But at this time he did not shut himself up so much as he had done. He worked for 2 or 3 hours every morning, and passed the afternoon strolling hither and thither in Paris and its vicinity. It was opposite the Institute, on his return from one of these long walks, that he knocked up against his old college friend, who had met with a nice little success, thanks to the good fellowship of his comrades, at the last salon. "What, is it you?" exclaimed the painter. "Ah, my poor Laurent, I hardly recognize you. You have lost flesh." "I am married," answered Laurent in an embarrassed tone. "Married, you!" said the other. "Then I am not surprised to see you look so funny. And what are you doing now?" "I have taken a small studio," replied Laurent, "and I paint a little, in the morning." Then, in a feverish voice, he briefly related the story of his marriage, and explained his future plans. His friend observed him with an air of astonishment that troubled and alarmed him. The truth was that the painter no longer found in the husband of Thérèse the coarse, common fellow he had known formerly. It seemed to him that Laurent was acquiring a gentlemanly bearing. His face had grown thinner, and had taken the pale tint of good taste, while his whole frame looked more upright and supple. "But you are becoming a handsome chap!" the artist could not refrain from exclaiming. "You are dressed like an ambassador, in the latest style. Who's your model?" Laurent, who felt the weight of the examination he was undergoing, did not dare to abruptly take himself off. "Will you come up to my studio for a moment?" he at last asked his friend, who showed no signs of leaving him. "Willingly," answered the latter. The painter, who could not understand the change he noticed in his old comrade, was anxious to visit his studio. He had no idea of climbing 5 floors to gaze on the new pictures of Laurent, which assuredly would disgust him. He merely wished to satisfy his curiosity. When he had reached the studio and had glanced at the canvases hanging against the walls, his astonishment redoubled. They comprised 5 studies, 2 heads of women and 3 of men painted with real vigor. They looked thick and substantial, each part being dashed off with magnificent dabs of color on a clear grey background. The artist quickly approached, and was so astounded that he did not even seek to conceal his amazement. "Did you do those?" he inquired of Laurent. "Yes," replied the latter. "They are studies that I intend to utilize in a large picture I am preparing." "Come, no humbug! Are you really the author of those things?" Yes. Why should I not be the author of them?" The painter did not like to answer what he thought, which was as follows: "Because those canvases are the work of an artist, and you have never been anything but a vile bungler." For a long time he remained before the studies in silence. Certainly they were clumsy, but they were original, and so powerfully executed that they indicated a highly developed idea of art. They were lifelike. Never had this friend of Laurent seen rough paintings so full of high promise. When he had examined all the canvases, he turned to the author of them, and said: "Well, frankly, I should never have thought you capable of painting like that. Where the deuce did you learn to have talent? It is not usually a thing that one acquires." And he considered Laurent, whose voice appeared to him more gentle, while every gesture he made had a sort of elegance. The artist had no idea of the frightful shock this man had received, and which had transformed him, developing in him the nerves of a woman, along with keen, delicate sensations. No doubt a strange phenomenon had been accomplished in the organism of the murderer of Camille. It is difficult for analysis to penetrate to such depths. Laurent had, perhaps, become an artist, as he had become afraid, after the great disorder that had upset his frame and mind. Previously he had been half choked by the fullness of his blood, blinded by the thick vapour of breath surrounding him. At present, grown thin and always shuddering, his manner had become anxious, while he experienced the lively and poignant sensations of a man of nervous temperament. In the life of terror that he led, his mind had grown delirious, ascending to the ecstasy of genius. The sort of moral malady, the neurosis wherewith all his being was agitated, had developed an artistic feeling of peculiar lucidity. Since he had killed, his frame seemed lightened, his distracted mind appeared to him immense, and, in this abrupt expansion of his thoughts, he perceived exquisite creations, the reveries of a poet passing before his eyes. It was thus that his gestures had suddenly become elegant, that his works were beautiful, and were all at once rendered true to nature and lifelike. The friend did not seek further to fathom the mystery attending this birth of the artist. He went off carrying his astonishment along with him, but before he left he again gazed at the canvases, and said to Laurent: "I have only one thing to reproach you with. All these studies have a family likeness, the 5 heads resemble each other. The women themselves have a peculiarly violent bearing that gives them the appearance of men in disguise. You will understand that if you desire to make a picture out of these studies, you must change some of the physiognomies. Your personages cannot all be brothers, or brothers and sisters, it would excite hilarity." He left the studio, and on the landing merrily added: "Really, my dear boy, I am very pleased to have seen you. Henceforth I shall believe in miracles. Good heavens, how highly respectable you do look!" As he went downstairs, Laurent returned to the studio, feeling very much upset. When his friend had remarked that all his studies of heads bore a family likeness, he had abruptly turned round to conceal his paleness. The fact was that he had already been struck by this fatal resemblance. Slowly entering the room, he placed himself before the pictures, and as he contemplated them, as he passed from one to the other, ice-like perspiration moistened his back. "He is quite right," he murmured. "They all resemble one another. They resemble Camille." He retired a step or two, and seated himself on the divan, unable to remove his eyes from the studies of heads. The first was an old man with a long white beard, and under this white beard the artist traced the lean chin of Camille. The second represented a fair young girl, who gazed at him with the blue eyes of his victim. Each of the other 3 faces presented a feature of the drowned man. It looked like Camille with the theatrical make-up of an old man, of a young girl, assuming whatever disguise it pleased the painter to give him, but still maintaining the general expression of his own countenance. There existed another terrible resemblance among these heads. They all appeared suffering and terrified, and seemed as though overburdened with the same feeling of horror. Each of them had a slight wrinkle to the left of the mouth, which, drawing down the lips, produced a grimace. This wrinkle, which Laurent remembered having noticed on the convulsed face of the drowned man, marked them all with the sign of vile relationship. Laurent understood that he had taken too long a look at Camille at the morgue. The image of the drowned man had become deeply impressed on his mind, and now his hand, without his being conscious of it, never failed to draw the lines of this atrocious face which followed him everywhere. Little by little the painter, who was allowing himself to fall back on the divan, fancied he saw the faces become animated. He had 5 Camilles before him, 5 Camilles whom his own fingers had powerfully created, and who, by terrifying peculiarity, were of various ages and of both sexes. He rose, he lacerated the pictures and threw them outside. He said to himself that he would die of terror in his studio, were he to people it with portraits of his victim. A fear had just come over him. He dreaded that he would no more be able to draw a head without reproducing that of the drowned man. He wished to ascertain at once whether he were master of his own hand. He placed a white canvas on his easel, and then, with a bit of charcoal, sketched out a face in a few lines. The face resembled Camille. Laurent swiftly effaced this drawing and tried another. For an hour he struggled against futility, which drove along his fingers. At each fresh attempt he went back to the head of the drowned man. He might indeed assert his will, and avoid the lines he knew so well. In spite of himself he drew those lines, he obeyed his muscles and his rebellious nerves. He had first of all proceeded rapidly with the sketches. He now took pains to pass the stick of charcoal slowly over the canvas. The result was the same. Camille, grimacing and in pain, appeared ceaselessly. The artist sketched the most different heads successively, the heads of angels, of virgins with aureoles, of Roman warriors with their helmets, of fair rosy children, of old bandits seamed with scars, and the drowned man always reappeared. He became, in turn, angel, virgin, warrior, child, and bandit. Then Laurent plunged into caricature. He exaggerated the features, he produced monstrous profiles, he invented grotesque heads, but only succeeded in rendering the striking portrait of his victim more horrible. He finished by drawing animals, dogs and cats, but even the dogs and cats vaguely resembled Camille. Laurent then became seized with sullen rage. He smashed the canvas with his fist, thinking in despair of his great picture. Now he must put that idea aside. He was convinced that, in future, he would draw nothing but the head of Camille, and as his friend had told him, faces all alike would cause hilarity. He pictured to himself what his work would have been, and perceived upon the shoulders of his personages, men and women, the livid and terrified face of the drowned man. The strange picture he thus conjured up appeared to him atrociously ridiculous and exasperated him. He no longer dared to paint, always dreading that he would resuscitate his victim at the least stroke of his brush. If he desired to live peacefully in his studio, he must never paint there. This thought that his fingers possessed the fatal and unconscious faculty of reproducing without end the portrait of Camille made him observe his hand in terror. It seemed to him that his hand no longer belonged to him. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vistelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Bologna Times. The crisis threatening Madame Raquin took place. The paralysis, which for several months had been creeping along her limbs, always ready to strangle her, at last took her by the throat and linked her body. One evening, while conversing peacefully with Thérèse and Laurent, she remained in the middle of a sentence with her mouth wide open. She felt as if she was being throttled. When she wanted to cry out and call for help, she could only splutter a few hoarse sounds. Her hands and feet were rigid. She found herself struck dumb and powerless to move. Thérèse and Laurent rose from their chairs, terrified at this stroke, which had contorted the old mercer in less than 5 seconds. When she became rigid, and fixed her supplicating eyes on them, they pressed her with questions in order to ascertain the cause of her suffering. Unable to reply, she continued gazing at them in profound anguish. They then understood that they had nothing but a corpse before them, a corpse half alive that could see and hear, but could not speak to them. They were in despair of this attack. At the bottom of their hearts they cared little for the suffering of the paralyzed woman. They mourned over themselves, who in future would have to live alone, face to face. From this day the life of the married couple became intolerable. They passed the most cruel evenings opposite the impotent old lady, who no longer lulled their terror with her gentle, idle chatter. She reposed in an armchair like a parcel, a thing, while they remained alone, one at each end of the table, embarrassed and anxious. This body no longer separated them. At times they forgot it, confounding it with the articles of furniture. They were now seized with the same terror as at night. The dining-room became, like the bedroom, a terrible spot, where the spectre of Camille arose, causing them to suffer an extra 4 or 5 hours daily. As soon as twilight came, they shuddered, lowering the lamp-shade so as not to see one another, and endeavoring to persuade themselves that Madame Raquin was about to speak, and thus remind them of her presence. If they kept her with them, if they did not get rid of her, it was because her eyes were still alive, and they experienced a little relief in watching them move and sparkle. They always placed the impotent old lady in the bright beam of the lamp, so as to thoroughly light up her face, and have it always before them. This flabby, livid countenance would have been a sight that others could not have borne, but Thérèse and Laurent experienced such need for company that they gazed upon it with real joy. This face looked like that of a dead person in the center of which 2 living eyes had been fixed. These eyes alone moved, rolling rapidly in their orbits. The cheeks and mouth maintained such appalling immobility that they seemed as though petrified. When Madame Raquin fell asleep and lowered her lids, her countenance, which was then quite white and mute, was really that of a corpse. Thérèse and Laurent, who no longer felt anyone with them, then made a noise until the paralyzed woman raised her eyelids and looked at them. In this manner they compelled her to remain awake. They regarded her as a distraction that drew them from their bad dreams. Since she had been infirm, they had to attend to her like a child. The care they lavished on her forced them to scatter their thoughts. In the morning Laurent lifted her up and bore her to her armchair. At night he placed her on her bed again. She was still heavy, and he had to exert all his strength to raise her delicately in his arms and carry her. It was also he who rolled her armchair along. The other attentions fell to Thérèse. She dressed and fed the impotent old lady, and sought to understand her slightest wish. For a few days Madame Raquin preserved the use of her hands. She could write on a slate, and in this way asked for what she required. Then the hands withered, and it became impossible for her to raise them or hold a pencil. From that moment her eyes were her only language, and it was necessary for her niece to guess what she desired. The young woman devoted herself to the hard duties of sick nurse, which gave her occupation for body and mind that did her much good. So as not to remain face to face, the married couple rolled the armchair of the poor old lady into the dining-room the first thing in the morning. They placed her between them, as if she were necessary to their existence. They caused her to be present at their meals, and at all their interviews. When she signified the desire to retire to her bedroom, they feigned not to understand. She was only of use to interrupt their private conversations, and had no right to live apart. At 8 o'clock, Laurent went to his studio. Thérèse descended to the shop, while the paralyzed woman remained alone in the dining-room until noon. Then, after lunch, she found herself without company again until 6 o'clock. Frequently, during the day, her niece ran upstairs, and hovering round her made sure she did not require anything. The friends of the family were at a loss for sufficiently laudatory phrases wherein to extol the virtues of Thérèse and Laurent. The Thursday receptions continued, the impotent old lady being present, as in the past. Her armchair was advanced to the table, and from 8 o'clock till 11 she kept her eyes open, casting penetrating glances from one to another of her guests in turn. On the first few of these evenings, old Michaud and Grivet felt some embarrassment in the presence of the corpse of their old friend. They did not know what countenance to put on. They only experienced moderate sorrow, and they were inquiring in their minds in what measure it would be suitable to display their grief. Should they speak to this lifeless form? Should they refrain from troubling about it? Little by little they decided to treat Madame Raquin as though nothing had happened to her. They ended by feigning to completely ignore her condition. They chatted with her, putting questions and giving the answers, laughing both for her and for themselves, and never permitting the rigid expression on the countenance to baffle them. It was a strange sight, these men who appeared to be speaking sensibly to a statue, just as little girls talk to their dolls. The paralyzed woman sat rigid and mute before them, while they babbled, multiplying their gestures in exceedingly animated conversations with her. Michaud and Grivet prided themselves on their correct attitude. In acting as they did, they believed they were giving proof of politeness. They, moreover, avoided the annoyance of the customary condolences. They fancied that Madame Raquin must feel flattered to find herself treated as a person in good health, and from that moment it became possible for them to be merry in her presence without the least scruple. Grivet had contracted a mania. He affirmed that Madame Raquin and himself understood one another perfectly, and that she could not look at him without him at once comprehending what she desired. This was another delicate attention. Only Grivet was on every occasion in error. He frequently interrupted the game of dominoes to observe the infirm woman whose eyes were quietly following the game, and declare that she wanted such or such a thing. On further inquiry it was found that she wanted nothing at all, or that she wanted something entirely different. This did not discourage Grivet, who triumphantly exclaimed, "Just as I said!" and he began again a few moments later. It was quite another matter when the impotent old lady openly expressed a desire. Thérèse, Laurent, and the guests named one object after another that they fancied she might wish for. Grivet then made himself remarkable by the clumsiness of his offers. He mentioned, haphazard, everything that came into his head, invariably offering the contrary to what Madame Raquin desired. But this circumstance did not prevent him repeating, "I can read in her eyes as in a book. Look, she says I am right. It is not so, dear lady? Yes, yes." Nevertheless, it was no easy matter to grasp the wishes of the poor old woman. Thérèse alone possessed this faculty. She communicated fairly well with this walled-up brain, still alive, but buried in a lifeless frame. What was passing within this wretched creature, just sufficiently alive to be present at the events of life, without taking part in them? She saw and heard, she no doubt reasoned in a distinct and clear manner. But she was without gesture and voice to express the thoughts originating in her mind. Her ideas were perhaps choking her, and yet she could not raise a hand nor open her mouth, even though one of her movements or words should decide the destiny of the world. Her mind resembled those of the living buried by mistake, who awaken in the middle of the night in the earth 3 or 4 yards below the surface of the ground. They shout, they struggle, and people pass over them without hearing their atrocious lamentations. Laurent frequently gazed at Madame Raquin, his lips pressed together, his hands stretched out on his knees, putting all his life into his sparkling and swiftly moving eyes. And he said to himself, "Who knows what she may be thinking of all alone? Some cruel drama must be passing within this inanimate frame." Laurent made a mistake. Madame Raquin was happy, happy at the care and affection bestowed on her by her dear children. She had always dreamed of ending in this gentle way, amidst devotedness and caresses. Certainly she would have been pleased to have preserved her speech, so as to be able to thank the friends who assisted her to die in peace. But she accepted her condition without rebellion. The tranquil and retired life she had always led, the sweetness of her character, prevented her feeling too acutely the suffering of being mute and unable to make a movement. She had entered second childhood. She passed days without weariness, gazing before her and musing on the past. She even tasted the charm of remaining very good in her armchair like a little girl. Each day the sweetness and brightness of her eyes became more penetrating. She had reached the point of making them perform the duties of a hand or mouth, in asking for what she required and in expressing her thanks. In this way she replaced the organs that were wanting, in a most peculiar and charming manner. Her eyes, in the centre of her flabby and grimacing face, were of celestial beauty. Since her twisted and inert lips could no longer smile, she smiled with adorable tenderness by her looks. Moist beams and rays of dawn issued from her orbits. Nothing was more peculiar than those eyes which laughed like lips in this lifeless countenance. The lower part of the face remained gloomy and wan, while the upper part was divinely lit up. It was particularly for her beloved children that she placed all her gratitude, all the affection of her soul into a simple glance. When Laurent took her in his arms, morning and night, to carry her, she had thanked him lovingly by looks full of tender effusion. She lived thus for weeks, awaiting death, fancying herself sheltered from any fresh misfortune. She thought she had already received her share of suffering, but she was mistaken. One night she was crushed by a frightful blow. Thérèse and Laurent might well place her between them in the full light, but she was no longer sufficiently animated to separate and defend them against their anguish. When they forgot that she was there, and could hear and see them, they were seized with folly. Perceiving Camille, they sought to drive him away. Then, in unsteady tones, they allowed the truth to escape them, uttering words that revealed everything to Madame Raquin. Laurent had a sort of attack, during which he spoke like one under the influence of hallucination, and the paralyzed woman abruptly understood. A frightful contraction passed over her face, and she experienced such a shock that Thérèse thought she was about to bound to her feet and shriek, but she fell backward, rigid as iron. This shock was all the most terrible as it seemed to galvanize a corpse. Sensibility, which had for a moment returned, disappeared. The impotent woman remained more crushed and wan than before. Her eyes, usually so gentle, had become dark and harsh, resembling pieces of metal. Never had despair fallen more rigorously on a being. The sinister truth, like a flash of flame, scorched the eyes of the paralyzed woman and penetrated within her with the concussion of a shaft of lightning. Had she been able to rise, to utter the cry of horror that ascended to her throat, and curse the murderers of her son, she would have suffered less. But, after hearing and understanding everything, she was forced to remain motionless and mute, inwardly preserving all the glare of her grief. It seemed to her that Thérèse and Laurent had bound her, riveted her to her armchair to prevent her springing up, and that they took atrocious pleasure in repeating to her, after gagging her to stifle her cries, "We have killed Camille!" Terror and anguish coursed furiously in her body, unable to find an issue. She made superhuman efforts to raise the weight crushing her, to clear her throat, and thus give passage to her flood of despair. In vain did she strain her final energy. She felt her tongue cold against her palate. She could not tear herself from death. Cadaverous impotence held her rigid. Her sensations resembled those of a man fallen into lethargy, who is being buried, and who, bound by the bonds of his own frame, hears the deadened sound of the shovels of mould falling on his head. The ravages to which her heart was subjected proved still more terrible. She felt a blow inwardly that completely undid her. Her entire life was afflicted at her tenderness, all her goodness, all her devotedness had just been brutally upset and trampled underfoot. She had led a life of affection and gentleness, and in her last hours, when about to carry to the grave a belief in the delight of a calm life, a voice shouted to her that all was falsehood and all crime. The veil being rent, she perceived apart from the love and friendship which was all she had hitherto been able to see, a frightful picture of blood and shame. She would have cursed the Almighty had she been able to shout out a blasphemy. Providence had deceived her for over 60 years, by treating her as a gentle, good little girl, by amusing her with lying representations of tranquil joy. And she had remained a child, senselessly believing in 1,000 silly things, and unable to see life as it really is, dragging along in the sanguinary filth of passions. Providence was bad. It should have told her the truth before, or have allowed her to continue in her innocence and blindness. Now it only remained for her to die, denying love, denying friendship, denying devotedness. Nothing existed but murder and lust. What! Camille had been killed by Thérèse and Laurent, and they had concealed the crime in shame. For Madame Raquin there was such a fathomless depth in this thought, that she could neither reason it out nor grasp it clearly. She experienced but one sensation, that of a horrible disaster. It seemed to her that she was falling into a dark, cold hole, and she said to herself, "I shall be smashed to pieces at the bottom." After the first shock, the crime appeared to her so monstrous that it seemed impossible. Then, when convinced of the misbehavior and murder, by recalling certain little incidents which she had formerly failed to understand, she was afraid of going out of her mind. Thérèse and Laurent were really the murderers of Camille. Thérèse, whom she had reared; Laurent, whom she had loved with the devoted and tender affection of a mother. These thoughts revolved in her head like an immense wheel, accompanied by a deafening noise. She conjectured such vile details, fathomed such immense hypocrisy, assisting in thought at a double vision so atrocious in irony that she would have liked to die, mechanical and implacable, pounded her brain with the weight and ceaseless action of a millstone. She repeated to herself, "It is my children who have killed my child," and she could think of nothing else to express her despair. In the sudden change that had come over her heart, she no longer recognized herself. She remained weighed down by the brutal invasion of ideas of vengeance that drove away all the goodness of her life. When she had been thus transformed, all was dark inwardly. She felt the birth of a new being within her frame, a being pitiless and cruel, who would have liked to bite the murderers of her son. When she had succumbed to the overwhelming stroke of paralysis, when she understood that she could not fly at the throats of Thérèse and Laurent, whom she longed to strangle, she resigned herself to silence and immobility, and great tears fell slowly from her eyes. Nothing could be more heartrending than this mute and motionless despair. Those tears coursing one by one down this lifeless countenance, not a wrinkle of which moved that inert, wan face which could not weep with its features, and whose eyes alone sobbed, presented a poignant spectacle. Thérèse was seized with horrified pity. "We must put her to bed," said she to Laurent, pointing to her aunt. Laurent hastened to roll the paralyzed woman into her bedroom. Then, as he stooped down to take her in his arms, Madame Raquin hoped that some powerful spring would place her on her feet, and she attempted a supreme effort. The Almighty would not permit Laurent to press her to his bosom. She fully anticipated he would be struck down if he displayed such monstrous impudence. But no spring came into action, and heaven reserved its lightning. Madame Raquin remained huddled up and passive like a bundle of linen. She was grasped, raised, and carried along by the assassin. She experienced the anguish of feeling herself feeble, and abandoned in the arms of the murderer of Camille. Her head rolled on to the shoulder of Laurent, whom she observed with eyes increased in volume by horror. "You may look at me," he murmured. "Your eyes will not eat me." And he cast her brutally on the bed. The impotent old lady fell unconscious on the mattress. Her last thought had been one of terror and disgust. In future, morning and night, she would have to submit to the vile pressure of the arms of Laurent. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 27. A shock of terror alone had made the married pair speak and avow their crime in the presence of Madame Raquin. Neither one nor the other was cruel. They would have avoided such a revelation out of feelings of humanity, had not their own security already made it imperative on their part to maintain silence. On the ensuing Thursday they felt particularly anxious. In the morning Thérèse inquired of Laurent whether he considered it prudent to leave the paralysed woman in the dining-room during the evening. She knew all, and might give the alarm. "Bah!" replied Laurent. "It is impossible for her to raise her little finger. How can she babble?" "She will perhaps discover a way to do so," answered Thérèse. "I have noticed an implacable thought in her eye since the other evening." "No," said Laurent. "You see, the doctor told me it was absolutely all over with her. If she ever speaks again, it will be in the final death rattle. She will not last much longer, you may be sure. It would be stupid to place an additional load on our conscience by preventing her being present at the gathering this evening." Thérèse shuddered. "You misunderstand me," she exclaimed. "Oh, you are right. There has been enough crime. I meant to say that we might shut our aunt up in her own room, pretending she was not well and was sleeping." "That's it," replied Laurent. "And that idiot Michaud would go straight into the room to see his old friend notwithstanding. It would be a capital way to ruin us." He hesitated. He wanted to appear calm, and anxiety gave a tremor to his voice. "It will be best to let matters take their course," he continued. "These people are as silly as geese. The mute despair of the old woman will certainly teach them nothing. They will never have the least suspicion of the thing, for they are too far away from the truth. Once the ordeal is over, we shall be at ease as to the consequences of our imprudence. All will be well, you will see." When the guests arrived in the evening, Madame Raquin occupied her usual place, between the stove and table. Thérèse and Laurent feigned to be in good spirits, concealing their shudders and awaiting in anguish the incident that was bound to occur. They had brought the lampshade very low down, so that the oilcloth table covering alone was lit up. The guests engaged in the usual noisy, commonplace conversation that invariably preceded the first game of dominoes. Grivet and Michaud did not fail to address the usual questions to the paralysed woman on the subject of her health, and to give excellent answers to them, as was their custom. After which, the company, without troubling any further about the poor old lady, plunged with delight into the game. Since Madame Raquin had become aware of the horrible secret, she had been awaiting this evening with feverish impatience. She had gathered together all her remaining strength to denounce the culprits. Up to the last moment, she feared she would not be present at the gathering. She thought Laurent would make her disappear, perhaps kill her, or at least shut her up in her own apartment. When she saw that her niece and nephew allowed her to remain in the dining-room, she experienced lively joy at the thought of attempting to avenge her son. Aware that her tongue was powerless, she resorted to a new kind of language. With astonishing power of will, she succeeded, in a measure, in galvanizing her right hand, in slightly raising it from her knee, where it always lay stretched out inert. She then made it creep little by little up one of the legs of the table before her, and thus succeeded in placing it on the oilcloth table cover. Then she feebly agitated the fingers as if to attract attention. When the players perceived this lifeless hand, white and nerveless before them, they were exceedingly surprised. Grivet stopped short, with his arm in the air, at the moment when he was about to play the double six. Since the impotent woman had been struck down, she had never moved her hands. "Hey, just look, Thérèse!" cried Michaud. "Madame Raquin is agitating her fingers. She probably wants something." Thérèse could not reply. Both she and Laurent had been following the exertion of the paralysed woman, and she was now looking at the hand of her aunt, which stood out wan in the raw light of the lamp, like an avenging hand that was about to speak. The two murderers waited, breathless. "Of course," said Grivet, "she wants something. Oh, we thoroughly understand one another. She wants to play dominoes, eh? Isn't it so, dear lady?" Madame Raquin made a violent sign, indicating that she wanted nothing of the kind. She extended one finger, folded up the others with infinite difficulty, and began to painfully trace letters on the table cover. She had barely indicated a stroke or two, when Grivet again exclaimed in triumph, "I understand! She says I do right to play the double six." The impotent woman cast a terrible glance at the old clerk, and returned to the word she wished to write. But Grivet interrupted her at every moment, declaring it was needless, that he understood, and he then brought out some stupidity. Michaud at last made him hold his tongue. "The deuce! Allow Madame Raquin to speak," said he. "Speak, my old friend." And he gazed at the oilcloth table cover as if he had been listening. But the fingers of the paralysed woman were growing weary. They had begun the word more than 10 times over, and now, in tracing this word, they wandered to right and left. Michaud and Olivier bent forward, and being unable to read, forced the impotent old lady to resume the first letters. "Ah, bravo!" exclaimed Olivier all at once. "I can read it this time. She has just written your name, Thérèse. Let me see. Thérèse and... Complete the sentence, dear lady." Thérèse almost shrieked in anguish. She watched the finger of her aunt gliding over the oilcloth, and it seemed to her that this finger traced her name and the confession of her crime in letters of fire. Laurent had risen violently, with half a mind to fling himself on the paralysed woman and break her arm. When he saw this hand return to life, to reveal the murder of Camille, he thought all was lost, and already felt the weight and frigidity of the knife on the nape of his neck. Madame Raquin still wrote, but in a manner that became more and more hesitating. "This is perfect. I can read it very well indeed," resumed Olivier after an instant, and with his eyes on the married pair. "Your aunt writes your 2 names, Thérèse and Laurent." The old lady made sign after sign in the affirmative, casting crushing glances on the murderers. Then she sought to complete the sentence, but her fingers had stiffened. The supreme will that galvanized them escaped her. She felt the paralysis slowly descending her arm and again grasping her wrist. She hurried on and traced another word. Old Michaud read out in a loud voice, "Thérèse and Laurent have..." And Olivier inquired, "What have your dear children?" The murderers, seized with blind terror, were on the point of completing the sentence aloud. They contemplated the avenging hand with fixed and troubled eyes, when all at once this hand became convulsed and flattened out on the table. It slipped down and fell on the knee of the impotent woman like a lump of inanimate flesh and bone. The paralysis had returned and arrested the punishment. Michaud and Olivier sat down again disappointed, while Thérèse and Laurent experienced such keen joy that they felt like fainting under the influence of the sudden rush of blood that beat in their bosoms. Grivet, who felt vexed at not having been believed on trust, thought the moment had arrived to regain his infallibility by completing the unfinished sentence. While everyone was endeavouring to supply the missing words, he exclaimed, "It is quite clear. I can read the whole phrase in the eyes of the lady. It is not necessary for her to write on the table to make me understand. A mere look suffices. She means to say, Thérèse and Laurent have been very kind to me." Grivet, on this occasion, had cause to be proud of his imagination, for all the company were of his opinion, and the guests began to sing the praises of the married couple, who were so good for the poor lady. "It is certain," old Michaud gravely remarked, "that Madame Raquin wishes to bear testimony to the tender affection her children lavish on her, and this does honour to the whole family." Then, taking up his dominoes again, he added, "Come, let us continue. Where were we? Grivet was about to play the double six, I think." Grivet played the double six, and the stupid, monotonous game went on. The paralysed woman, cut up by frightful despair, looked at her hand, which had just betrayed her. She felt it as heavy as lead now. Never would she be able to raise it again. Providence would not permit Camille to be avenged. It withdrew from his mother the only means she had of making known the crime to which he had fallen a victim. And the wretched woman said to herself that she was now only fit to go and join her child underground. She lowered her lids, feeling herself henceforth useless, and with the desire of imagining herself already in the darkness of the tomb. End of chapter 27, recording by Kate Mackenzie.
Chapter 28 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 28. For 2 months, Thérèse and Laurent had been struggling in the anguish of their union. One suffered through the other. Then hatred slowly gained them, and they ended by casting angry glances at one another, full of secret menace. Hatred was forced to come. They had loved like brutes, with hot passion, entirely sanguineous. Then, amidst the enervation of their crime, their love had turned to fright, and their kisses had produced a sort of physical terror. At present, amid the suffering which marriage, which life in common imposed on them, they revolted and flew into anger. It was a bitter hatred, with terrible outbursts. They felt they were in the way of one another, and both inwardly said that they would lead a tranquil existence were they not always face to face. When in presence of each other, it seemed as if an enormous weight were stifling them, and they would have liked to remove this weight, to destroy it. Their lips were pinched, thoughts of violence passed in their clear eyes, and a craving beset them to devour one another. In reality, one single thought tormented them. They were irritated at their crime, and in despair at having forever troubled their lives. Hence all their anger and hatred. They felt the evil incurable, that they would suffer for the murder of Camille until death, and this idea of perpetual suffering exasperated them. Not knowing whom to strike, they turned in hatred on one another. They would not openly admit that their marriage was the final punishment of the murder. They refused to listen to the inner voice that shouted out the truth to them, displaying the story of their life before their eyes. And yet, in the fits of rage that bestirred them, they both saw clearly to the bottom of their anger. They were aware it was the furious impulse of their egotistic nature that had urged them to murder in order to satisfy their desire, and that they had only found in assassination an afflicted and intolerable existence. They recollected the past. They knew that their mistaken hopes of lust and peaceful happiness had alone brought them to remorse. Had they been able to embrace one another in peace and live in joy, they would not have mourned Camille, they would have fattened on their crime. But their bodies had rebelled, refusing marriage, and they inquired of themselves in terror where horror and disgust would lead them. They only perceived a future that would be horrible in pain, with a sinister and violent end. Then, like two enemies bound together, and who were making violent efforts to release themselves from this forced embrace, they strained their muscles and nerves, stiffening their limbs without succeeding in releasing themselves. At last understanding that they would never be able to escape from their clasp, irritated by the cords cutting into their flesh, disgusted at their contact, feeling their discomfort increase at every moment, forgetful, and unable to bear their bonds a moment longer, they addressed outrageous reproaches at one another, in the hope of suffering loss, of addressing the wounds they inflicted on themselves, by cursing and deafening each other with their shouts and accusations. A quarrel broke out every evening. It looked as though the murderers sought opportunities to become exasperated, so as to relax their rigid nerves. They watched one another, sounded one another with glances, examined the wounds of one another, discovering the raw parts, and taking keen pleasure in causing each other to yell in pain. They lived in constant irritation, weary of themselves, unable to support a word, a gesture, or a look, without suffering and frenzy. Both their beings were prepared for violence, the least display of impatience, the most ordinary contrariety in their disordered organism, and all at once took the form of brutality. A mere nothing raised a storm that lasted until the morrow. A plate too warm, an open window, a denial, a simple observation, sufficed to drive them into regular fits of madness. In the course of the discussion they never failed to bring up the subject of the drowned man. From sentence to sentence they came to mutual reproaches about this drowning business at St. Owen, casting the crime in the face of one another. They grew excited to the pitch of fury, until one felt like murdering the other. Then ensued atrocious scenes of choking, blows, abominable cries, shameless brutalities. As a rule, Thérèse and Laurent became exasperated in this manner after the evening meal. They shut themselves up in the dining room so that the sound of their despair should not be heard. There they could devour one another at ease. At the end of this damp apartment, of this sort of vault, light of the yellow beams of the lamp, the tone of their voices took harrowing sharpness amidst the silence and tranquillity of the atmosphere. And they did not cease until exhausted with fatigue. Then only could they go and enjoy a few hours' rest. Their quarrels became, in a measure, necessary to them, a means of procuring a few hours' rest by stupefying their nerves. Madame Raquin listened. She never ceased to be there, in her armchair, her hands dangling on her knees, her head straight, her face mute. She heard everything, and not a shudder ran through her lifeless frame. Her eyes rested on the murderers with the most acute fixedness. Her martyrdom must have been atrocious. She thus learned detail by detail all the events that had preceded and followed the murder of Camille. Little by little her ears became polluted with an account of the filth and crimes of those whom she had called her children. These quarrels of the married couple placed her in possession of the most minute circumstances connected with the murder, and spread out, one by one, before her terrified mind all the episodes of the horrible adventure. As she went deeper into this sanguinary filth, she pleaded in her mind for mercy. At times she fancied she was touching the bottom of the infamy, and still she had to descend lower. Each night she learnt some new detail. The frightful story continued to expand before her. It seemed like being lost in an interminable dream of horror. The first avowal had been brutal and crushing, but she suffered more from these repeated blows, from these small facts which the husband and wife allowed to escape them in their fits of anger, and which lit up the crime with sinister rays. Once a day this mother heard the account of the murder of her son, and each day this account became more horrifying, more complete with detail, and was shouted into her ears with greater cruelty and uproar. On one occasion Thérèse, taken aback with remorse at the sight of this wan countenance, with great tears slowly coursing down its cheeks, pointed out her aunt to Laurent, beseeching him with a look to hold his tongue. "Well, what of it? Leave me alone," exclaimed the latter in a brutal tone. "You know very well that she cannot give us up. Am I more happy than she is? We have her cash. I have no need to constrain myself." The quarrel continued, bitter and piercing, and Camille was killed over again. Neither Thérèse nor Laurent dared give way to the thoughts of pity that sometimes came over them, and shut the paralyzed woman in her bedroom when they quarrelled, so as to spare her the story of the crime. They were afraid of beating one another to death if they failed to have the semi-corpse between them. Their pity yielded to cowardice. They imposed ineffable sufferings on Madame Raquin because they required her presence to protect them against their hallucinations. All their disputes were alike and led to the same accusations. As soon as one of them accused the other of having killed this man, there came a frightful shock. One night at dinner, Laurent, who sought a pretext for becoming irritable, found that the water in the decanter was lukewarm. He declared that tepid water made him feel sick and that he wanted it fresh. "I was unable to procure any ice," Thérèse answered dryly. "Very well, I will deprive myself of drinking," retorted Laurent. "This water is excellent," said she. "It is warm and has a muddy taste," he answered. "It's like water from the river." "Water from the river?" repeated Thérèse, and she burst out sobbing. A juncture of ideas had just occurred in her mind. "Why do you cry?" asked Laurent, who foresaw the answer and turned pale. "I cry," sobbed the young woman. "I cry because you know why. Oh, great God, it was you who killed him." "You lie!" shouted the murderer vehemently. "Confess that you lie. If I threw him into the Seine, it was you who urged me to commit the murder." I!" she exclaimed. "Yes, you! Don't act the ignorant," he replied. "Don't compel me to force you to tell the truth. I want you to confess your crime, to take your share in the murder. It will tranquilize and relieve me." "But I did not drown Camille," she pleaded. "Yes, you did, 1,000 times yes," he shouted. "Oh, you feign astonishment and want of memory. Wait a moment, I will recall your recollections." Rising from table, he bent over the young woman, and with crimson countenance yelled in her face: "You were on the river bank, you remember, and I said to you in an undertone, 'I'm going to pitch him into the water.' Then you agreed to it. You got into the boat. You see that we murdered him together." "It is not true," she answered. "I was crazy. I don't know what I did. But I never wanted to kill him. You alone committed the crime." These denials tortured Laurent. As he had said, the idea of having an accomplice relieved him. Had he dared, he would have attempted to prove to himself that all the horror of the murder fell upon Thérèse. He more than once felt inclined to beat the young woman, so as to make her confess that she was the more guilty of the two. He began striding up and down, shouting and raving, followed by the piercing eyes of Madame Raquin. "Ah, the wretch! The wretch!" he stammered in a choking voice. "She wants to drive me mad. Look, did you not come up to my room one evening? Did you not intoxicate me with your caresses to persuade me to rid you of your husband? You told me when I visited you here that he displeased you, that he had the odor of a sickly child. Did I think of all this 3 years ago? Was I a rascal? I was leading the peaceful existence of an upright man, doing no harm to anybody. I would not have killed a fly." "It was you who killed Camille," repeated Thérèse with such desperate obstinacy that she made Laurent lose his head. "No, it was you! I say it was you!" he retorted with a terrible burst of rage. "Look here, don't exasperate me, or if you do, you'll suffer for it. What, you wretch, have you forgotten everything? You who maddened me with your caresses, confess that it was all a calculation in your mind, that you hated Camille, and that you had wanted to kill him for a long time. No doubt you took me as a sweetheart so as to drive me to put an end to him." "It is not true," said she. "What you relate is monstrous. You have no right to reproach me with my weakness towards you. I can speak in regard to you, as you speak of me. Before I knew you, I was a good woman, who never wronged a soul. If I drove you mad, it was you who made me madder still. Listen, Laurent, don't let us quarrel. I have too much to reproach you with." "What can you reproach me with?" he inquired. "No, nothing," she answered. "You did not save me from myself. You took advantage of my surrender. You chose to spoil my life. I forgive you all that. But, in mercy, do not accuse me of killing Camille. Keep your crime for yourself. Do not seek to make me more terrified than I am already." Laurent raised his hand to strike her in the face. "Beat me, I prefer that," said she. "I shall suffer less." And she advanced her head, but he restrained himself, and taking a chair, sat down beside her. "Listen," he began in a voice that he endeavored to render calm. "It is cowardly to refuse to take your share in the crime. You know perfectly well that as we did the deed together, you know you are as guilty as I am. Why do you want to make my load heavier by saying you are innocent? If you were so, you would not have consented to marry me. Just recall what passed during the 2 years following the murder. Do you want a proof? If so, I will go and relate everything to the public prosecutor, and you will see whether we are not both condemned." They shuddered, and Thérèse resumed: "Men may, perhaps, condemn me, but Camille knows very well that you did everything. He does not torment me at night as he does you." "Camille leaves me in peace," said Laurent, pale and trembling. "It is you who see him before you in your nightmares. I have heard you shout out." "Don't say that!" angrily exclaimed the young woman. "I have never shouted out. I don't wish the spectre to appear. Oh, I understand. You want to drive it away from yourself. I am innocent. I'm innocent!" They looked at one another in terror, exhausted with fatigue, fearing they had evoked the corpse of the drowned man. Their quarrels invariably ended in this way. They protested their innocence, they sought to deceive themselves, so as to drive away their bad dreams. They made constant efforts, each in turn, to reject the responsibility of the crime, defending themselves as though they were before a judge and jury, and accusing one another. The strangest part of this attitude was that they did not succeed in duping themselves by their oaths. Both had a perfect recollection of all the circumstances connected with the murder, and their eyes avowed what their lips denied. Their falsehoods were puerile, their affirmations ridiculous. It was the wordy dispute of two wretches who lied for the sake of lying, without succeeding in concealing from themselves that they did so. Each took the part of accuser in turn, and although the prosecution they instituted against one another proved barren of result, they began it again every evening with cruel tenacity. They were aware that they would prove nothing, that they would not succeed in effacing the past. And still they attempted this task, still they returned to the charge, spurred on by pain and terror, vanquished in advance by overwhelming reality. The sole advantage they derived from their disputes consisted in producing a tempest of words and cries, and the riot occasioned in this manner momentarily deafened them. And all the time their anger lasted, all the time they were accusing one another, the paralyzed woman never ceased to gaze at them. Ardent joy sparkled in her eyes when Laurent raised his broad hand above the head of Thérèse. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 29. Matters now took a different aspect. Thérèse, driven into a corner by fright, not knowing which way to turn for a consoling thought, began to weep aloud over the drowned man in the presence of Laurent. She abruptly became depressed, her overstrained nerves relaxed, her unfeeling and violent nature softened. She had already felt compassionate in the early days of her second marriage, and this feeling now returned, as a necessary and fatal reaction. When the young woman had struggled with all her nervous energy against the spectre of Camille, when she had lived in sullen irritation for several months, up in arms against her sufferings, seeking to get the better of them by efforts of will, she all at once experienced such extraordinary lassitude that she yielded vanquished. Then, having become a woman again, even a little girl, no longer feeling the strength to stiffen herself, to stand feverishly erect before her terror, she plunged into pity, into tears and regret, in the hope of finding some relief. She sought to reap advantage from her weakness of body and mind. Perhaps the drowned man, who had not given way to her irritation, would be more unbending to her tears. Her remorse was all calculation. She thought that this would no doubt be the best way to appease and satisfy Camille. Like certain devotees, who fancy they will deceive the Almighty, and secure pardon by praying with their lips, and assuming the humble attitude of penitence, Thérèse displayed humility, striking her chest, finding words of repentance, without having anything at the bottom of her heart save fear and cowardice. Besides, she experienced a sort of physical pleasure in giving way in this manner, in feeling feeble and undone, in abandoning herself to grief without resistance. She overwhelmed Madame Raquin with her tearful despair. The paralyzed woman became of daily use to her. She served as a sort of praying desk, as a piece of furniture in front of which Thérèse could fearlessly confess her faults and plead for forgiveness. As soon as she felt inclined to cry, to divert herself by sobbing, she knelt before the impotent old lady, and there, wailing and choking, performed to her alone a scene of remorse which weakened but relieved her. "I am a wretch," she stammered. "I deserve no mercy. I deceived you. I drove your son to his death. Never will you forgive me. And yet, if you only knew how I am rent by remorse, if you only knew how I suffer, perhaps you would have pity. No, no pity for me. I should like to die here at your feet, overwhelmed by shame and grief." She spoke in this manner for hours together, passing from despair to hope, condemning and then pardoning herself. She assumed the voice, brief and plaintive in turn, of a little sick girl. She flattened herself on the ground and drew herself up again, acting upon all the ideas of humility and pride, of repentance and revolt that entered her head. Sometimes even, forgetting she was on her knees before Madame Raquin, she continued her monologue as in a dream. When she had made herself thoroughly giddy with her own words, she rose staggering and dazed, to go down to the shop in a calmer frame of mind, no longer fearing to burst into sobs before her customers. When she again felt inclined for remorse, she ran upstairs and knelt at the feet of the impotent woman. This scene was repeated 10 times a day. Thérèse never reflected that her tears and display of repentance must impose ineffable anguish on her aunt. The truth was that if she had desired to invent a torment, to torture Madame Raquin, it would not have been possible to have found a more frightful one than the comedy of remorse she performed before her. The paralyzed woman could see the egotism concealed beneath these effusions of grief. She suffered horribly from these long monologues, which she was compelled to listen to at every instant, and which always brought the murder of Camille before her eyes. She could not pardon, she never departed from the implacable thought of vengeance that her impotency rendered more keen, and all day long she had to listen to pleas for pardon and to humble and cowardly prayers. She would have liked to give an answer. Certain sentences of her niece brought crushing refusals to her lips, but she had to remain mute and allow Thérèse to plead her cause without once interrupting her. The impossibility of crying out and stopping her ears caused her inexpressible torture. The words of the young woman entered her mind, slow and plaintive as an irritating ditty. At first she fancied the murderers inflicted this kind of torture on her out of sheer diabolical cruelty. Her sole means of defense was to close her eyes as soon as her niece knelt before her, then although she heard, she did not see her. Thérèse at last had the impudence to kiss her aunt. One day, in a fit of repentance, she feigned she had perceived a gleam of mercy in the eyes of the paralyzed woman, and she dragged herself along on her knees. She raised herself up, exclaiming in a distracted tone, "You forgive me! You forgive me!" Then she kissed the forehead and cheeks of the poor old creature, who was unable to throw her head backward so as to avoid the embrace. The cold skin on which Thérèse placed her lips caused her violent disgust. She fancied this disgust, like the tears of remorse, would be an excellent remedy to appease her nerves, and she continued to kiss the impotent old woman daily by way of penitence and also to relieve herself. "Oh, how good you are!" she sometimes exclaimed. "I can see my tears have touched you. Your eyes are full of pity. I am saved." Then she smothered her with caresses, placing the head of the infirm old lady on her knees, kissing her hands, smiling at her happily, and attending to all her requirements with a display of passionate affection. After a time she believed in the reality of this comedy. She imagined she had obtained the pardon of Madame Raquin, and spoke of nothing but the delight she experienced at having secured her pardon. This was too much for the paralyzed woman. It almost killed her. At the kisses of her niece, she again felt the sensation of bitter repugnance and rage which came over her morning and night when Laurent took her in his arms to lift her up or lay her down. She was obliged to submit to the disgusting caresses of the wretch who had betrayed and killed her son. She could not even use her hand to wipe away the kisses that this woman left on her cheeks, and for hours and hours together she felt these kisses burning her. She became the doll of the murderers of Camille, a doll that they dressed, that they turned to right and left, and that they made use of according to their requirements and whims. She remained inert in their hands, as if she had been a lay figure, and yet she lived, and became excited and indignant at the least contact with Thérèse or Laurent. What particularly exasperated her was the atrocious mockery of the young woman, who pretended she perceived expressions of mercy in her eyes, when she would have liked to have brought down fire from heaven on the head of the criminal. She frequently made supreme efforts to utter a cry of protestation, and loaded her looks with hatred, but Thérèse, who found it answered her purpose to repeat 20 times a day that she was pardoned, redoubled her caresses, and would see nothing. So the paralyzed woman had to accept the thanks and effusions that her heart repelled. Henceforth she lived in a state of bitter but powerless irritation, face to face with her yielding niece, who displayed adorable acts of tenderness to recompense her for what she termed her heavenly goodness. When Thérèse knelt before Madame Raquin in the presence of her husband, he brutally brought her to her feet. "No acting," said he. "Do I weep? Do I prostrate myself? You do all this to trouble me." The remorse of Thérèse caused him peculiar agitation. His suffering increased now that his accomplice dragged herself about him, with eyes red by weeping and supplicating lips. The sight of this living example of regret redoubled his fright and added to his uneasiness. It was like an everlasting reproach wandering through the house. Then he feared that repentance would one day drive his wife to reveal everything. He would have preferred her to remain rigid and threatening, bitterly defending herself against his accusations. But she had changed her tactics. She now readily recognized the share she had taken in the crime. She even accused herself. She had become yielding and timid, and starting from this point, implored redemption with ardent humility. This attitude irritated Laurent, and every evening the quarrels of the couple became more afflicting and sinister. "Listen to me," said Thérèse to her husband. "We are very guilty. We must repent if we wish to enjoy tranquillity. Look at me. Since I have been weeping I am more peaceable. Imitate me. Let us say together that we are justly punished for having committed a horrible crime." "Bah!" roughly answered Laurent. "You can say what you please. I know you are deucedly clever and hypocritical. Weep if that diverts you, but I must beg you not to worry me with your tears." "Ah," said she, "you are bad. You reject remorse. You are cowardly. You acted as a traitor to Camille." "Do you mean to say that I alone am guilty?" he inquired. "No," she replied, "I do not say that. I am guilty, more guilty than you are. I ought to have saved my husband from your hands. Oh, I am aware of all the horror of my fault, but I have sought pardon, and I have succeeded, Laurent, whereas you continue to lead a disconsolate life. You have not even had the feeling to spare my poor aunt the sight of your vile anger. You have never even addressed a word of regret to her." And she embraced Madame Raquin, who shut her eyes. She hovered round her, raising the pillow that propped up her head, and showing her all kinds of attention. Laurent was infuriated. "Oh, leave her alone," he cried. "Can't you see that your services and the very sight of you are odious to her? If she could lift her hand she would slap your face." The slow and plaintive words of his wife, and her attitudes of resignation, gradually drove him into blinding fits of anger. He understood her tactics. She no longer wished to be at one with him, but to set herself apart, wrapped in her regret, so as to escape the clasp of the drowned man. And at moments he said to himself that she had perhaps taken the right path, that tears might cure her of her terror, and he shuddered at the thought of having to suffer and contend with fright alone. He also would have liked to repent, or at least to have performed the comedy of repentance, to see what effect it would have. Unable to find the sobs and necessary words, he flung himself into violence again, stirring up Thérèse so as to irritate her and lead her back with him to furious madness. But the young woman took care to remain inert, to answer his cries of anger by tearful submission, and to meet his coarseness by a proportionate display of humility and repentance. Laurent was thus gradually driven to fury. To crown his irritation, Thérèse always ended with the panegyric of Camille, so as to display the virtues of the victim. "He was good," said she, "and we must have been very cruel to assail such a warm-hearted man who had never a bad thought." "He was good, yes, I know," jeered Laurent. "You mean to say he was a fool. You must have forgotten. You pretended you were irritated at the slightest thing he said, that he could not open his mouth without letting out some stupidity." "Don't jeer," said Thérèse. "It only remains for you to insult the man you murdered. You know nothing about the feelings of a woman, Laurent. Camille loved me and I loved him." "You loved him! Ha! Really, what a capital idea!" exclaimed Laurent. "And no doubt it was because you loved your husband that you took me as a sweetheart. I remember one day when we were together that you told me Camille disgusted you, when you felt the end of your fingers enter his flesh as if it were soft clay. Oh, I know why you loved me. You required more vigorous arms than those of that poor devil." "I loved him as a sister," answered Thérèse. "He was the son of my benefactress. He had all the delicate feelings of a feeble man. He showed himself noble and generous, serviceable and loving. And we killed him. Good God! Good God!" She wept and swooned away. Madame Raquin cast piercing glances at her, indignant to hear the praise of Camille sung by such a pair of lips. Laurent, who was unable to do anything against this overflow of tears, walked to and fro with furious strides, searching in his head for some means to stifle the remorse of Thérèse. All the good he heard said of his victim ended by causing him poignant anxiety. Now and again he let himself be caught by the heart-rending accents of his wife. He really believed in the virtues of Camille, and his terror redoubled. But what tried his patience beyond measure was the comparison that the widow of the drowned man never failed to draw between her first and second husband, and which was all to the advantage of the former. "Well, yes," she cried, "he was better than you. I would sooner he were alive now, and you in his place underground." Laurent first of all shrugged his shoulders. "Say what you will," she continued, becoming animated. "Although I perhaps failed to love him in his lifetime, yet I remember all his good qualities now, and do love him. Yes, I love him and hate you, do you hear? For you are an assassin." "Will you hold your tongue?" yelled Laurent. "And he is a victim," she went on, notwithstanding the threatening attitude of her husband. "An upright man killed by a rascal. Oh, I am not afraid of you. You know well enough that you are a miserable wretch, a brute of a man without a heart and without a soul. How can you expect me to love you, now that you are reeking with the blood of Camille? Camille was full of tenderness for me, and I would kill you, do you hear, if that could bring him to life again, and give me back his love." "Will you hold your tongue, you wretch?" shouted Laurent. "Why should I hold my tongue?" she retorted. "I am speaking the truth. I would purchase forgiveness at the price of your blood. Ah, how I weep and how I suffer! It is my own fault if a scoundrel such as you murdered my husband. I must go one of these nights and kiss the ground where he rests. That will be my final rapture." Laurent, beside himself, rendered furious by the atrocious pictures that Thérèse spread out before his eyes, rushed upon her and threw her down, menacing her with his uplifted fist. "That's it!" she cried. "Strike me! Kill me! Camille never once raised his hand to me, but you are a monster!" And Laurent, spurred on by what she said, shook her with rage, beat her, bruised her body with his clenched fists. In 2 instances he almost strangled her. Thérèse yielded to his blows. She experienced keen delight in being struck, delivering herself up, thrusting her body forward, provoking her husband in every way, so that he might half kill her again. This was another remedy for his suffering. She slept better at night, when she had been thoroughly beaten in the evening. Madame Raquin enjoyed exquisite pleasure when Laurent dragged her knees along the floor in this way, belabouring her with thumps and kicks. The existence of the assassin had become terrible since the day when Thérèse conceived the infernal idea of feeling remorse and of mourning Camille aloud. From that moment the wretch lived everlastingly with his victim. At every hour he had to listen to his wife praising and regretting her first husband. The least incident became a pretext. Camille did this, Camille did that, Camille had such and such qualities, Camille loved in such and such a way. It was always Camille, ever sad remarks bewailing his death. Thérèse had recourse to all her spitefulness to render this torture, which she inflicted on Laurent so as to shield her own self, as cruel as possible. She went into details, relating 1,000 insignificant incidents connected with her youth, accompanied by sighs and expressions of regret, and in this manner mingled the remembrance of the drowned man with every action of her daily life. The corpse which had already haunted the house was introduced there openly. It sat on the chairs, took its place at table, extended itself on the bed, making use of the various articles of furniture and of the objects lying about hither and thither. Laurent could touch nothing, not a fork, not a brush, without Thérèse making him feel that Camille had touched it before him. The murder being ceaselessly thrust, so as to say, against the man he had killed, ended by experiencing a strange sensation that very nearly drove him out of his mind. By being so constantly compared to Camille, by making use of the different articles Camille had used, he imagined he was Camille himself, that he was identical with his victim. Then, with his brain fit to burst, he blew at his wife to make her hold her tongue, so as to no longer hear the words that drove him frantic. All their quarrels now ended in blows. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. translated by Ernest Alfred Visdelli. Chapter 30. A time came when Madame Raquin, in order to escape the sufferings she endured, thought of starving herself to death. She had reached the end of her courage. She could no longer support the martyrdom that the presence of the two murderers imposed on her. She longed to find supreme relief in death. Each day her anguish grew more keen. When Thérèse embraced her, and when Laurent took her in his arms to carry her along like a child, she determined on freeing herself from these clasps and caresses that caused her such horrible disgust. As she had not sufficient life left within her to permit of her avenging her son, she preferred to be entirely dead, and to leave naught in the hands of the assassins but a corpse that could feel nothing, and with which they could do as they pleased. For 2 days she refused all nourishment, employing her remaining strength to clench her teeth or to eject anything that Thérèse succeeded in introducing into her mouth. Thérèse was in despair. She was asking herself at the foot of which post she should go to weep and repent when her aunt would be no longer there. She kept up an interminable discourse to prove to Madame Raquin that she should live. She wept, she even became angry, bursting into her former fits of rage, opening the jaw of the paralyzed woman as you open that of an animal which resists. Madame Raquin held out, and an odious scene ensued. Laurent remained absolutely neutral and indifferent. He was astonished at the efforts of Thérèse to prevent the impotent old woman committing suicide. Now that the presence of the old lady had become useless to them, he desired her death. He would not have killed her, but as she wished to die, he did not see the use of depriving her of the means to do so. "But let her be," he shouted to his wife. "It will be a good riddance. We shall perhaps be happier when she is no longer here." This remark, repeated several times in the hearing of Madame Raquin, caused her extraordinary emotion. She feared that the hope expressed by Laurent might be realized, and that after her death the couple would enjoy calm and happiness. And she said to herself that it would be cowardly to die, that she had no right to go away before she had seen the end of the sinister adventure. Then only could she descend into darkness, to say to Camille, "You are avenged." The idea of suicide became oppressive, when she all at once reflected that she would sink into the grave ignorant as to what had happened to the two murderers of her son. There she would lie in the cold and silent earth, eternally tormented by uncertainty concerning the punishment of her tormentors. To thoroughly enjoy the slumber of death, she must be hushed to rest by the sweet delight of vengeance. She must carry away with her a dream of satisfied hatred, a dream that would last throughout eternity. So she took the food her niece presented to her, and consented to live on. Apart from this, it was easy for her to perceive that the climax could not be far off. Each day the position of the married couple became more strained and unbearable. A crash that would smash everything was imminent. At every moment Thérèse and Laurent started up face to face in a more threatening manner. It was no longer at night time alone that they suffered from their intimacy. Entire days were passed amidst anxiety and harrowing shocks. It was one constant scene of pain and terror. They lived in a perfect pandemonium, fighting, rendering all they did and said bitter and cruel, seeking to fling one another to the bottom of the abyss which they felt beneath their feet, and falling into it together. Ideas of separation had, indeed, occurred to both of them. Each had thought of flight, of seeking some repose far from this arcade of the Pont Neuf, where the damp and filth seemed adapted to their desolated life. But they dared not, they could not run away. It seemed impossible for them to avoid reviling each other, to avoid remaining there to suffer and cause pain. They proved obstinate in their hatred and cruelty. A sort of repulsion and attraction separated and kept them together at the same time. They behaved in the identical manner of two persons who, after quarreling, wish to part, and who, nevertheless, continue returning to shout out fresh insults at one another. Moreover, material obstacles stood in the way of flight. What were they to do with the impotent woman? What could be said to the Thursday evening guests? If they fled, these people would, perhaps, suspect something. At this thought, they imagined they were being pursued and dragged to the guillotine. So they remained where they were, through cowardice, wretchedly dragging out their lives amidst the horror of their surroundings. During the morning and afternoon, when Laurent was absent, Thérèse went from the dining-room to the shop, in anxiety and trouble, at a loss to know what to do to fill up the void in her existence that daily became more pronounced. When not kneeling at the feet of Madame Raquin, or receiving blows and insults from her husband, she had no occupation. As soon as she was seated alone in the shop, she became dejected, watching with a doltish expression the people passing through the dirty, dark gallery. She felt ready to die of sadness in the middle of this gloomy vault, which had the odor of a cemetery, and ended by begging Suzanne to come and pass entire days with her, in the hope that the presence of this poor, gentle, pale creature might calm her. Suzanne accepted her offer with delight. She continued to feel a sort of respectful friendship for Thérèse, and had long desired to come and work with her, while Olivier was at his office. Bringing her embroidery with her, she took the vacant chair of Madame Raquin behind the counter. From that day, Thérèse rather neglected her aunt. She went upstairs less frequently to weep on her knees and kiss the death-like face of the invalid. She had something else to do. She made efforts to listen with interest to the dilatory gossip of Suzanne, who spoke of her home and of the trivialities of her monotonous life. This relieved Thérèse of her own thoughts. Sometimes she caught herself paying attention to nonsense that brought a bitter smile to her face. By degrees she lost all her customers. Since her aunt had been confined to her armchair upstairs, she had let the shop go from bad to worse, abandoning the goods to dust and damp. A smell of mildew hung in the atmosphere. Spiders came down from the ceiling. The floor was but rarely swept. But what put the customers to flight was the strange way in which Thérèse sometimes welcomed them. When she happened to be upstairs, receiving blows from Laurent, or agitated by a shock of terror, and the bell at the shop door tinkled imperiously, she had to go down, barely taking time to do up her hair or brush away the tears. On such occasions she served the persons awaiting her roughly. Sometimes she even spared herself the trouble of serving, answering from the top of the staircase that she no longer kept what was asked for. This kind of offhand behavior was not calculated to retain custom. The little work-girls of the quarter, who were used to the sweet amiability of Madame Raquin, were driven away by the harshness and wild looks of Thérèse. When the latter took Suzanne with her to keep her company, the defection became complete. To avoid being disturbed in their gossip, the two young women managed to drive away the few remaining purchasers who visited the shop. Henceforth, the mercery business ceased to bring in a sou towards the household expenses, and it became necessary to encroach on the capital of 40,000 francs and more. Sometimes Thérèse absented herself the entire afternoon. No one knew where she went. Her reason for having Suzanne with her was no doubt partly for the purpose of securing company, but also to mind the shop while she was away. When she returned in the evening, worn out, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion, it was to find the little wife of Olivier still behind the counter, bowed down with a vague smile on her lips, in the same attitude as she had left her 5 hours previously. Thérèse had a bad fright about 5 months after her marriage to Laurent. She found out she was pregnant, and detested the thought of having a child of Laurent's. She had the fear that she would give birth to a drowned body. She thought that she could feel inside herself a soft, decomposing corpse. No matter what, she had to rid herself of this child. She did not tell Laurent. One day she cruelly provoked him and turned her stomach towards him, hoping to receive a kick. He kicked her, and she let him go on kicking her in the stomach until she thought she would die. The next day her wish was fulfilled, and she had a miscarriage. Laurent also led a frightful existence. The days seemed insupportably long. Each brought the same anguish, the same heavy weariness which overwhelmed him at certain hours with crushing monotony and regularity. He dragged on his life, terrified every night by the recollections of the day, and the expectation of the morrow. He knew that henceforth all his days would resemble one another, and bring him equal suffering. And he saw the weeks, months, and years gloomily and implacably awaiting him, coming one after the other to fall upon him and gradually smother him. When there is no hope in the future, the present appears atrociously bitter. Laurent no longer resisted. He became lumpish, abandoning himself to the nothingness that was already gaining possession of his being. Idleness was killing him. In the morning he went out, without knowing where to go, disgusted at the thought of doing what he had done on the previous day, and compelled, in spite of himself, to do it again. He went to his studio by habit, by mania. This room, with its grey walls, whence he could see naught but a bare square of sky, filled him with mournful sadness. He grovelled on the divan heavy in thought, and with pendant arms. He dared not touch a brush. He had made fresh attempts at painting, but only to find on each occasion the head of Camille appear jeering on the canvas. So as not to go out of his mind, he ended by throwing his colour-box into a corner, and imposing the most absolute idleness on himself. This obligatory laziness weighed upon him terribly. In the afternoon he questioned himself in distress to find out what he should do. For half an hour he remained on the pavement in the Rue Mazarine, thinking and hesitating as to how he could divert himself. He rejected the idea of returning to the studio, and invariably decided on going down the Rue Guénégaud to walk along the quays. And until evening he went along, dazed and seized with sudden shudders whenever he looked at the Seine. Whether in his studio or in the streets, his dejection was the same. The following day he began again. He passed the morning on his divan, and dragged himself along the quays in the afternoon. This lasted for months, and might last for years. Occasionally, Laurent reflected that he had killed Camille so as to do nothing ever afterwards, and now that he did nothing, he was quite astonished to suffer so much. He would have liked to force himself to be happy. He proved to his own satisfaction that he did wrong to suffer, that he had just attained supreme felicity, consisting in crossing his arms, and that he was an idiot not to enjoy this bliss and peace. But his reasoning exploded in the face of facts. He was constrained to confess, at the bottom of his heart, that this idleness rendered his anguish the more cruel, by leaving him every hour of his life to ponder on the despair and deepen its incurable bitterness. Laziness, that brutish existence which had been his dream, proved his punishment. At moments he ardently hoped for some occupation to draw him from his thoughts. Then he lost all energy, relapsing beneath the weight of implacable fatality that bound his limbs so as to more surely crush him. In truth, he only found some relief when beating Thérèse at night. This brutality alone relieved him of his enervated anguish. But his keenest suffering, both physical and moral, came from the bite Camille had given him in the neck. At certain moments he imagined that this scar covered the whole of his body. If he came to forget the past, he all at once fancied he felt a burning puncture that recalled the murder both to his frame and mind. When under the influence of emotion, He could not stand before a looking-glass without noticing this phenomenon which he had so frequently remarked, and which always terrified him. The blood flew to his neck, purpling the scar, which then began to gnaw the skin. This sort of wound that lived upon him, which became active, flushed, and biting at the slightest trouble, frightened and tortured him. He ended by believing that the teeth of the drowned man had planted an insect there, which was devouring him. The part of his neck where the scar appeared seemed to him to no longer belong to his body. It was like foreign flesh that had been stuck in this place, a piece of poisoned meat that was rotting his own muscles. In this manner he carried the living and devouring recollection of his crime about him with him everywhere. When he beat Thérèse, she endeavored to scratch the spot, and sometimes dug her nails into it, making him howl with pain. She generally pretended to sob as soon as she caught sight of the bite, so as to make it more insufferable to Laurent. All her revenge for his brutality consisted in martyrizing him in connection with this bite. While shaving, he had frequently been tempted to give himself a gash in the neck, so as to make the marks of the teeth of the drowned man disappear. When, standing before the mirror, he raised his chin and perceived the red spot beneath the white lather, he at once flew into a rage, and rapidly brought the razor to his neck, to cut right into the flesh. But the sensations of the cold steel against his skin always brought him to his senses, and caused him to feel so faint that he was obliged to seat himself, and wait until he had recovered sufficient courage to continue shaving. He only issued from his torpor at night to fall into blind and puerile fits of anger. When tired of quarrelling with Thérèse and beating her, he would kick the walls like a child, and look for something he could break. This relieved him. He had a particular dislike for the tabby cat François, who, as soon as he appeared, sought refuge on the knees of Madame Raquin. If Laurent had not yet killed the animal, it was because he dared not take hold of him. The cat looked at him with great round eyes that were diabolical in their fixedness. He wondered what these eyes, which never left him, wanted, and he ended by having regular fits of terror and imagining all sorts of ridiculous things. When at table, at no matter what moment, in the middle of a quarrel or of a long silence, he happened, all at once, to look round and perceive François examining him with a harsh, implacable stare. He turned pale and lost his head. He was on the point of saying to the cat, "Heh! Why don't you speak? Tell me what it is you want with me." When he could crush his paw or tail, he did so in affrighted joy, the mewing of the poor creature giving him vague terror, as though he heard a human cry of pain. Laurent, in fact, was afraid of François, particularly since the latter passed his time on the knees of the impotent old lady, as if in the centre of an impregnable fortress, whence he could with impunity set his eyes on his enemy. The murderer of Camille established a vague resemblance between this irritated animal and the paralyzed woman, saying to himself that the cat, like Madame Raquin, must know about the crime, and would denounce him if he ever found a tongue. At last, one night, François looked at Laurent so fixedly that the latter, irritated to the last pitch, made up his mind to put an end to the annoyance. He threw the window of the dining-room wide open, and, advancing to where the cat was seated, grasped him by the skin at the back of the neck. Madame Raquin understood, and 2 big tears rolled down her cheeks. The cat began to swear, and stiffen himself, endeavoring to turn round and bite the hand that grasped him. But Laurent held fast. He whirled the cat round 2 or 3 times in the air, and then sent him flying with all the strength of his arm against the great dark wall opposite. François went flat against it, and breaking his spine, fell upon the glass roof of the arcade. All night the wretched beast dragged himself along the gutter, mewing hoarsely, while Madame Raquin wept over him almost as much as she had done over Camille. Thérèse had an atrocious attack of hysterics, while the wailing of the cat sounded sinisterly in the gloom below the windows. Laurent soon had further cause for anxiety. He became alarmed at a certain change he observed in the attitude of his wife. Thérèse became sombre and taciturn. She no longer lavished effusions of repentance and grateful kisses on Madame Raquin. In presence of the paralyzed woman, she resumed her manner of frigid cruelty and egotistic indifference. It seemed as though she had tried remorse, and finding no relief, had turned her attention to another remedy. Her sadness was no doubt due to her inability to calm her life. She observed the impotent old woman with a kind of disdain, as a useless thing that could no longer even serve her for consolation. She now only bestowed on her the necessary attention to prevent her dying of hunger. From this moment she dragged herself about the house in silence and dejection. She multiplied her absences from the shop, going out as frequently as 3 and 4 times a week. It was this change in her mode of life that surprised and alarmed Laurent. He fancied that her remorse had taken another form, and was now displayed by this mournful weariness he noticed in her. This weariness seemed to him more alarming than the chattering despair she had overwhelmed him with previously. She no longer spoke, she no longer quarrelled with him, she seemed to consign everything to the depths of her being. He would rather have heard her exhausting her endurance than see her keep in this manner to herself. He feared that one day she would be choking with anguish, and to obtain relief would go and relate everything to a priest or an examining magistrate. Then these numerous absences of Thérèse had frightful significance in his eyes. He thought she went to find a confidant outside, that she was preparing her treason. On 2 occasions he tried to follow her, and lost her in the streets. He then prepared to watch her again. A fixed idea got into his head. Thérèse, driven to extremities by suffering, was about to make disclosures, and he must gag her, he must arrest her confession in her throat. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Therese Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vistelli. Chapter 31. One morning Laurent, instead of going to his studio, took up a position at a wine shop situated at one of the corners of the Rue Guénégaud, opposite the studio. From there he began to examine the persons who issued from the passage onto the pavement of the Rue Mazarine. He was watching for Thérèse. The previous evening the young woman had mentioned that she intended going out next day, and probably would not be home until evening. Laurent waited fully half an hour. He knew that his wife always went by the Rue Mazarine. Nevertheless, at one moment he remembered that she might escape him by taking the Rue de Seine, and he thought of returning to the arcade, and concealing himself in the corridor of the house. But he determined to retain his seat a little longer, and just as he was growing impatient, he suddenly saw Thérèse coming rapidly from the passage. She wore a light gown, and for the first time he noticed that her attire appeared remarkably showy, like a street walker. She twisted her body about on the pavement, staring provokingly at the men who came along, and raising her skirt, which she clutched in a bunch in her hand, much higher than any respectable woman would have done, in order to display her lace-up boots and stockings. As she went up the Rue Mazarine, Laurent followed her. It was mild weather, and the young woman walked slowly, with her head thrown slightly backward and her hair streaming down her back. The men who had first of all stared her in the face turned round to take a back view. She passed into the Rue de l'École des Médecins. Laurent was terrified. He knew that somewhere in this neighborhood was a commissariat of police, and he said to himself that there could no longer be any doubt as to the intentions of his wife. She was certainly about to denounce him. Then he made up his mind to rush after her, if she crossed the threshold of the commissariat, to implore her, to beat her if necessary, so as to compel her to hold her tongue. At a street corner she looked at a policeman who came along, and Laurent trembled with fright, lest she should stop and speak to him. In terror of being arrested on the spot if he showed himself, he hid in a doorway. This excursion proved perfect agony. While his wife basked in the sun on the pavement, trailing her skirt with nonchalance and impudence, shameless and unconcerned, he followed behind her, pale and shuddering, repeating that it was all over, that he would be unable to save himself, and would be guillotined. Each step he saw her take seemed to him a step nearer punishment. Fright gave him a sort of blind conviction, and the slightest movement of the young woman added to his certainty. He followed her. He went where she went, as a man goes to the scaffold. Suddenly, on reaching the former Place Saint-Michel, Thérèse advanced towards a café that then formed the corner of the Rue Monsieur le Prince. There she seated herself in the centre of a group of women and students, at one of the tables on the pavement, and familiarly shook hands with all this little crowd. Then she called for absinthe. She seemed quite at ease, chatting with a fair young man who no doubt had been waiting for her some time. Two girls came and leant over the table where she sat, addressing her affectionately in their husky voices. Around her, women were smoking cigarettes, men were embracing women in the open street, before the passers-by, who never even turned their heads. Low words and hoarse laughter reached Laurent, who remained motionless in a doorway on the opposite side of the street. When Thérèse had finished her absinthe, she rose, and, leaning on the arm of the fair young man, went down the Rue de la Harpe. Laurent followed them as far as the Rue Saint-Andre-des-Arts, where he noticed them entering a lodging-house. He remained in the middle of the street with his eyes on the front of the building. Presently his wife showed herself for an instant at an open window on the second floor, and he fancied he perceived the hands of the pale young man encircling her waist. Then the window closed with a sharp clang. Laurent understood. Without waiting a moment longer, he tranquilly took himself off, reassured and happy. "Bah!" he said to himself as he went towards the quays. "It's better, after all, that she should have a sweetheart. That will occupy her mind, and prevent her thinking of injuring me. She's deucedly more clever than I am." What astonished him was that he had not been the first to think of plunging into vice, which might have driven away his terror. But his thoughts had never turned in that direction, and moreover he had not the least inclination for riotous living. The infidelity of his wife did not trouble him in the least. He felt no anger at the knowledge that she was in the arms of another man. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy the idea. He began to think that he had been following the wife of a comrade, and laughed at the cunning trick the woman was playing her husband. Thérèse had become such a stranger to him that he no longer felt her alive in his heart. He would have sold her, bound hand and foot, 100 times over, to purchase calm for 1 hour. As he sauntered along, he enjoyed the sudden delightful reaction that had just brought him from terror to peace. He almost thanked his wife for having gone to a sweetheart, when he thought her on her way to a commissary of police. This adventure had come to an unforeseen end that agreeably surprised him. It distinctly showed him that he had done wrong to tremble, and that he, in his turn, should try vice, in order to see whether such a course would not relieve him by diverting his thoughts. On returning to the shop in the evening, Laurent decided that he would ask his wife for a few thousand francs, and that he would resort to high-handed measures to obtain them. Reflection told him that vice would be an expensive thing for a man. He patiently awaited Thérèse, who had not yet come in. When she arrived, he affected gentleness, and refrained from breathing a word about having followed her in the morning. She was slightly tipsy, and from her ill-adjusted garments came that unpleasant odor of tobacco and spirits that is met with in public drinking places. Completely exhausted, and with cheeks as pale as death, she advanced at an unsteady gait, and with a head quite heavy from the shameless fatigue of the day. The dinner passed in silence. Thérèse ate nothing. At dessert, Laurent placed his elbows on the table, and flatly asked her for 5,000 francs. "No," she answered dryly. "If I were to give you a free hand, you'd bring us to beggary. Aren't you aware of our position? We are going as fast as ever we can to the dogs." "That may be," he quietly resumed. "I don't care a fig. I intend to have money." "No, 1,000 times no," she retorted. "You left your place. The mercery business is in a very bad way, and the revenue from my marriage portion is not sufficient to maintain us. Every day I encroach on the principal to feed you and give you the 100 francs a month you wrung from me. You will not get anything beyond that, do you understand? So it's no use asking." "Just reflect," he replied, "and don't be so silly as to refuse. I tell you I mean to have 5,000 francs, and I shall have them. You'll give them me, in spite of all." This quiet determination irritated Thérèse and put the finishing touch to her intoxication. "Ah, I know what it is!" she cried. "You want to finish as you began. We have been keeping you for 4 years. You only came to us to eat and drink, and since then you've been at our charge. Monsieur does nothing. Monsieur has arranged so as to live at my expense, with his arms folded one over the other. No, you shall have nothing, not a sou. Do you want me to tell you what you are? Well then, you are a—" And she pronounced the word. Laurent began to laugh, shrugging his shoulders. He merely replied, "You learn some pretty expressions in the company you keep now." This was the only allusion he ventured to make to the love affairs of Thérèse. She quickly raised her head, and bitterly replied, "Anyhow, I don't keep the company of murderers." Laurent became very pale, and for a moment remained silent, with his eyes fixed on his wife. Then, in a trembling voice, he resumed, "Listen, my girl. Don't let us get angry. There is no good in that neither for you nor me. I've lost all courage. We had better come to an understanding if we wish to avoid a misfortune. If I ask you for 5,000 francs, it is because I want them, and I will even tell you what I intend to do with them, so as to ensure our tranquillity." He gave her a peculiar smile, and continued, "Come, reflect. Let me have your last word." "I have thoroughly made up my mind," answered the young woman, "and it is as I have told you. You shall not have a sou." Her husband rose violently. She was afraid of being beaten. She crouched down, determined not to give way to blows. But Laurent did not even approach her. He confined himself to telling her in a frigid tone that he was tired of life, and was about to relate the story of the murder to the commissary of police of the quarter. "You drive me to extremes," said he. "You make my life unbearable. I prefer to have done with it. We shall both be tried and condemned, and there will be an end to it all." "Do you think you'll frighten me?" shouted his wife. "I am as weary as you are. I'll go to the commissary of police myself, if you don't. Ah, indeed, I am quite ready to follow you to the scaffold. I'm not a coward like you. Come along with me to the commissary." She had risen, and was making her way to the staircase. "That's it," stammered Laurent. "Let's go together." When they were down in the shop, they looked at one another, anxious and alarmed. It seemed as though they were riveted to the ground. The few seconds they had taken to run downstairs had sufficed to show them, as in a flash, all the consequences of a confession. They saw at the same moment, suddenly and distinctly, gendarmes, prison, assize, court and guillotine. This made them feel faint, and they were tempted to throw themselves on their knees, one before the other, to implore one another to remain and reveal nothing. Fright and embarrassment kept them motionless and mute for 2 or 3 minutes. Thérèse was the first to make up her mind to speak and give way. "After all," said she, "I am a great fool to quarrel with you about this money. You will succeed in getting hold of it, and squandering it, one day or another. I may just as well give it you at once." She did not seek to conceal her defeat any further. She seated herself at the counter, and signed a cheque for 5,000 francs, which Laurent was to present to her banker. There was no more question of the commissary of police that evening. As soon as Laurent had the gold in his pocket, he began to lead a riotous life, drinking to excess, and frequenting women of ill repute. He slept all day and stayed out all night, in search of violent emotions that would relieve him of reality. But he only succeeded in becoming more oppressed than before. When the company were shouting around him, he heard the great, terrible silence within him. When one of his lady-loves kissed him, when he drained his glass, he found naught at the bottom of his satiety but heavy sadness. He was no longer a man for lust and gluttony. He chilled being, as if inwardly rigid, became enervated at the kisses and feasts. Feeling disgusted beforehand, they failed to arouse his imagination or to excite his senses and stomach. He suffered a little more by forcing himself into a dissolute mode of life, and that was all. Then, when he returned home, when he saw Madame Raquin and Thérèse again, his weariness brought on frightful fits of terror. And he vowed he would leave the house no more, that he would put up with his suffering, so as to become accustomed to it, and be able to conquer it. For a month Thérèse lived, like Laurent, on the pavement and in the cafés. She returned daily for a moment in the evening to feed Madame Raquin and put her to bed, and then disappeared again until the morrow. She and her husband on one occasion were 4 days without setting eyes on each other. At last she experienced profound disgust at the life she was leading, feeling that vice succeeded no better with her than the comedy of remorse. In vain had she dragged through all the lodging-houses in the Latin Quarter, in vain had she led a low, riotous life. Her nerves were ruined. Debauchery ceased to give her a sufficiently violent shock to render her oblivious of the past. She resembled one of those drunkards whose scorched palates remain insensible to the most violent spirits. She had done with lust, and the society of her paramours only worried and wearied her. Then she quitted them as useless. She now fell a prey to despondent idleness, which kept her at home in a dirty petticoat, with hair uncombed, and face and hands unwashed. She neglected everything and lived in filth. When the two murderers came together again, face to face, in this manner, after having done their best to get away from each other, they understood that they would no longer have strength to struggle. Debauchery had rejected them. It had just cast them back to their anguish. Once more they were in the dark, damp lodging in the arcade, and henceforth were as if imprisoned there, for although they had often attempted to save themselves, never had they been able to sever the sanguinary bond attaching them. They did not even think of attempting a task they regarded as impossible. They found themselves so urged on, so overwhelmed, so securely fastened together by events, that they were conscious all resistance would be ridiculous. They resumed their life in common, but their hatred became furious rage. The quarrels at night began again, but for that matter, the blows and cries lasted all day long. To hatred, distrust was now added, and distrust put the finishing touch to their folly. They were afraid of each other. The scene that had followed the demand for 5,000 francs was repeated morning and night. They had the fixed idea that they wanted to give one another up. From that standpoint they did not depart. When either of them said a word or made a gesture, the other imagined that he or she, as the case might be, intended to go to the commissary of police. Then they either fought or implored one another to do nothing. In their anger they shouted out that they would run and reveal everything, and terrified each other to death. After this they shuddered, they humbled themselves, and promised with bitter tears to maintain silence. They suffered most horribly, but had not the courage to cure themselves by placing a red-hot iron on the wound. If they threatened one another to confess the crime, it was merely to strike terror into each other and drive away the thought, for they would never have had strength to speak and seek peace in punishment. On more than 20 occasions they went as far as the door of the commissariat of police, one following the other. Now it was Laurent who wanted to confess the murder, now Thérèse who ran to give herself up. But they met in the street, and always decided to wait, after an interchange of insults and ardent prayers. Every fresh attack made them more suspicious and ferocious than before. From morning till night they were spying upon one another. Laurent barely set his foot outside the lodging in the arcade, and if, perchance, he did absent himself, Thérèse never failed to accompany him. Their suspicions, their fright lest either should confess, brought them together, united them in atrocious intimacy. Never since their marriage had they lived so tightly tied together, and never had they experienced such suffering. But notwithstanding the anguish they imposed on themselves, they never took their eyes off one another. They preferred to endure the most excruciating pain rather than separate for an hour. If Thérèse went down to the shop, Laurent followed, afraid that she might talk to a customer. If Laurent stood in the doorway, observing the people passing through the arcade, Thérèse placed herself beside him to see that he did not speak to anyone. When the guests were assembled on Thursday evenings, the murderers addressed supplicating glances to each other, listening to one another in terror, one accomplice expecting the other to make some confession, and giving an involving interpretation to sentences only just commenced. Such a state of warfare could not continue any longer. Thérèse and Laurent had both reached the point of pondering on the advisability of extricating themselves from the consequences of their first crime by committing a second. It became absolutely necessary that one of them should disappear so that the other might enjoy some repose. This reflection came to them both at the same time. Both felt the urgent necessity for a separation, and both desired that it should be eternal. The murder that now occurred to their minds seemed to them natural, fatal, and forcibly brought about by the murder of Camille. They did not even turn the matter over in their heads, but welcomed the idea as the only means of safety. Laurent determined he would kill Thérèse, because she stood in his way, because she might ruin him by a word, and because she caused him unbearable suffering. Thérèse made up her mind that she would kill Laurent for the same reasons. The firm resolution to commit another murder somewhat calmed them. They formed their plans, but in that respect they acted with feverish excitement, and without any display of excessive prudence. They only thought vaguely of the probable consequences of a murder committed without flight and immunity being ensured. They felt the invincible necessity to kill one another, and yielded to this necessity like furious brutes. They would not have exposed themselves for the first crime, which they had so cleverly concealed, and yet they risked the guillotine in committing a second, which they did not even attempt to hide. Here was a contradiction in their conduct that they never so much as caught sight of. Both simply said to themselves that if they succeeded in fleeing, they would go and live abroad, taking all the cash with them. Thérèse, a fortnight of 3 weeks before, had drawn from the bank the few thousand francs that remained of her marriage portion, and kept them locked up in a drawer, a circumstance that had not escaped Laurent. The fate of Madame Raquin did not trouble them an instant. A few weeks previously, Laurent had met one of his old college friends, now acting as dispenser to a famous chemist, who gave considerable attention to toxicology. This friend had shown him over the laboratory where he worked, pointing out to him the apparatus and the drugs. One night, after he had made up his mind in regard to the murder, and as Thérèse was drinking a glass of sugar and water before him, Laurent remembered that he had seen in this laboratory a small stoneware flagon containing prussic acid, and that the young dispenser had spoken to him of the terrible effects of this poison, which strikes the victim down with sudden death, leaving but few traces behind. and Laurent said to himself that this was the poison he required. On the morrow, succeeding in escaping the vigilance of Thérèse, he paid his friend a visit, and while he had his back turned, stole the small stoneware flagon. The same day, Thérèse took advantage of the absence of Laurent to send the large kitchen knife with which they were in the habit of breaking the loaf sugar, and which was very much notched, to be sharpened. When it came back, she hid it in a corner of the sideboard. End of Chapter 31.
Chapter 32 and afterward of Therese Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 32. The following Thursday, the evening party at the Raquins, as the guests continued to term the household of their hosts, was particularly merry. It was prolonged until 11:30, and as Grivet withdrew, he declared that he had never passed such a pleasant time. Suzanne, who was not very well, never ceased talking to Thérèse of her pain and joy. Thérèse appeared to listen to her with great interest, her eyes fixed, her lips pinched, her head, at moments, bending forward, while her lowering eyelids cast a cloud over the whole of her face. Laurent, for his part, gave uninterrupted attention to the tales of old Michaud and Olivier. These gentlemen never paused, and it was only with difficulty that Grivet succeeded in getting in a word edgeways between a couple of sentences of father and son. He had a certain respect for these two men, whom he considered good talkers. On that particular evening, a gossip having taken the place of the usual game, he naively blurted out that the conversation of the former commissary of police amused him almost as much as dominoes. During the 4 years, or thereabouts, that the Michauds and Grivet had been in the habit of passing the Thursday evenings at the Raquins, they had not once felt fatigued at these monotonous evenings that returned with enervating regularity. Never had they for an instant suspected the drama that was being performed in this house, so peaceful and harmonious, when they entered it. Olivier, with the jest of a person connected with the police, was in the habit of remarking that the dining room savoured of the honest man. Grivet, so as to have his say, had called the place the Temple of Peace. Latterly, on 2 or 3 different occasions, Thérèse explained the bruises disfiguring her face by telling the guests she had fallen down. But none of them, for that matter, would have recognized the marks of the fist of Laurent. They were convinced as to their host being a model pair, replete with sweetness and love. The paralyzed woman had not made any fresh attempt to reveal to them the infamy concealed behind the dreary tranquillity of the Thursday evenings. An eyewitness to the tortures of the murderers, and foreseeing the crisis which would burst out, one day or another, brought on by the fatal succession of events, she at length understood that there was no necessity for her intervention. And from that moment she remained in the background, allowing the consequences of the murder of Camille, which were to kill the assassins in their turn, to take their course. She only prayed Heaven to grant her sufficient life to enable her to be present at the violent catastrophe she foresaw. Her only remaining desire was to feast her eyes on the supreme suffering that would undo Thérèse and Laurent. On this particular evening, Grivet went and seated himself beside her, and talked for a long time, he, as usual, asking the questions and supplying the answers himself. But he failed to get even a glance from her. When 11:30 struck, the guests quickly rose to their feet. "We are so comfortable with you," said Grivet, "that no one ever thinks of leaving." "The fact is," remarked Michaud, by way of supporting the old clerk, "I never feel drowsy here, although I generally go to bed at 9 o'clock." Olivier thought this was a capital opportunity for introducing his little joke. "You see," said he, displaying his yellow teeth, "this apartment savours of honest people. That is why we are so comfortable here." Grivet, annoyed at being forestalled, began to declaim with an emphatic gesture: "This room is the Temple of Peace." In the meanwhile, Suzanne, who was putting on her hat, remarked to Thérèse: "I will come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock." "No," hastened to answer the young woman in a strange troubled tone. "Don't come until the afternoon. I have an engagement in the morning." She accompanied the guests into the arcade, and Laurent also went down with a lamp in his hand. As soon as the married couple were alone, both heaved a sigh of relief. They must have been devoured by secret impatience all the evening. Since the previous day they had become more sombre, more anxious in presence of one another. They avoided looking at each other, and returned in silence to the dining room. Their hands gave slight convulsive twitches, and Laurent was obliged to place the lamp on the table, to avoid letting it fall. Before putting Madame Raquin to bed, they were in the habit of setting the dining room in order, of preparing a glass of sugar and water for the night, of moving hither and thither about the invalid until everything was ready. When they got upstairs on this particular occasion, they sat down an instant with pale lips, and eyes gazing vaguely before them. Laurent was the first to break silence. "Well, aren't we going to bed?" he inquired, as if he had just started from a dream. "Yes, yes, we are going to bed," answered Thérèse, shivering as though she felt a violent chill. She rose and grasped the water decanter. "Let it be!" exclaimed her husband, in a voice that he endeavoured to render natural. "I will prepare the sugar and water. You attend to your aunt." He took the decanter of water from the hands of his wife and poured out a glassful. Then, turning half round, he emptied the contents of the small stoneware flagon into the glass at the same time as he dropped a lump of sugar into it. In the meanwhile Thérèse had bent down before the sideboard, and grasping the kitchen knife, sought to slip it into one of the large pockets hanging from her waist. At the same moment a strange sensation which comes as a warning note of danger made the married couple instinctively turn their heads. They looked at one another. Thérèse perceived the flagon in the hands of Laurent, and the latter caught sight of the flash of the blade in the folds of the skirt of his wife. For a few seconds they examined each other, mute and frigid, the husband near the table, the wife stooping down before the sideboard. And they understood. Each of them turned icy cold on perceiving that both had the same thought, and they were overcome with pity and horror at mutually reading the secret design of the other on their agitated countenances. Madame Raquin, feeling the catastrophe near at hand, watched them with piercing, fixed eyes. Thérèse and Laurent all at once burst into sobs. A supreme crisis undid them, cast them into the arms of one another, as weak as children. It seemed to them as if something tender and sweet had awakened in their breasts. They wept without uttering a word, thinking of the vile life they had led, and would still lead if they were cowardly enough to live. Then, at the recollection of the past, they felt so fatigued and disgusted with themselves that they experienced a huge desire for repose, for nothingness. They exchanged a final look, a look of thankfulness, in presence of the knife and glass of poison. Thérèse took the glass, half emptied it, and handed it to Laurent, who drank off the remainder of the contents at one draught. The result was like lightning. The couple fell one atop of the other, struck down, finding consolation at last in death. The mouth of the young woman rested on the scar that the teeth of Camille had left on the neck of her husband. The corpses lay all night, spread out contorted, on the dining room floor, lit up by the yellow gleams from the lamp which the shade cast upon them. And for nearly 12 hours, in fact until the following day at about noon, Madame Raquin, rigid and mute, contemplated them at her feet, overwhelming them with her heavy gaze, and unable to sufficiently gorge her eyes with the hideous sight. Afterward. The idea of the plot of Therese Raquin, according to Monsieur Paul Alexis, Zola's biographer, came from a novel called La Venus de Godet, contributed to the Figaro by Adolphe Belot and Ernest Daudet, the brother of Alphonse Daudet, in collaboration. In this story the authors dealt with the murder of a man by his wife and her paramour, followed by the trial of the murderers at the assizes. Zola, in noticing the book in the Figaro when it arrived for review, pointed out that a much more powerful story might be written on the same subject by invoking divine instead of human justice. For instance, showing the two murderers, safe from earthly consequences, yet separated by the pool of blood between them, haunted by their crime, and detesting one another for the deed done together. It then occurred to Zola to write the tale on these lines himself. Convinced that the idea was good, he collaborated it with the greatest care and all the skill at his command, the result being that he produced a volume which proved his first genuine success, and which is still considered by many to be his very best book. Edward Vizetelly. End of chapter 32 and afterward. End of Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly.